Silas Crow didn't wait for sunrise. He rode onto the Mercer property before the roosters had crowed, with 2 armed men flanking him and a folded paper in his breast pocket that he called a legal document, and that wasn't worth the ink it had cost him. Rosalie Mercer was still inside, still half asleep, when she heard the horses. By the time she reached the front door, Crow had already dismounted and was walking toward her father's barn like the land already belonged to him, because in his mind, it always had. "You have until noon," he said, without looking at her. "Anything still on the property after noon becomes mine." Rosalie's father had been dead for 11 days. If you've ever watched someone steal in broad daylight while calling it justice, then you already know what Rosalie Mercer felt standing barefoot in her father's doorway, watching Silas Crow pace off the corners of her inheritance like a man measuring carpet. If this story made your blood boil from the first sentence, you're exactly the kind of viewer this channel was made for. Subscribe now so you don't miss what comes next, because this story is only getting started. Hit the like button and drop a comment telling us what city or country you're watching from. I want to see how far this story travels. Now let's go back to where it really began. The night Elias Boone found Rosalie Mercer crouched in his henhouse, he almost shot her, not out of cruelty. Elias wasn't a cruel man, but it was past 2. In the morning, the Montana summer was sitting heavy and airless over the valley, and he'd already lost 2 hens to something getting into the coop over the past week. He'd assumed fox. He'd assumed wrong. He came out barefoot, rifle in one hand and a lantern in the other, moving quiet the way men who'd spent years alone learned to move without ceremony, without announcement, with the particular patience of someone who expected the world to disappoint him and had made his peace with it. The henhouse door was already open. Not broken, just open. Someone had lifted the latch with care, which told him it wasn't an animal. He pushed the door wide with the barrel of the rifle and held the lantern up. She was in the far corner, pressed against the wall where the shadows were deepest, knees drawn up and arms wrapped around herself. She was a big woman, heavy-set, with wide shoulders and a round face that might have been pretty on a better day, but tonight looked gray with exhaustion and fear. Her dress was the color of dried mud and patched so many times in so many places that it was hard to say what the original fabric had been. Her hair had come loose from whatever it had been pinned into and hung in clumps around her face. She was holding 2 eggs, not a basket, not a sack. Just 2 eggs, one pressed against each side of her chest, cradled there like she was trying to keep them warm, or like she was afraid that if she set them down, they'd break before she had a chance to use them. Elias stared at her. She stared back. Neither of them spoke for a long moment that stretched out in the lantern light while the hens shuffled and muttered around them, indifferent to the drama. "Those are my eggs," Elias said finally. "I know." Her voice was low and flat. She didn't try to hide or run or make excuses. She just looked at him the way someone looks at a man with a rifle, when they've already decided that whatever happens next, they're not going to beg. Elias lowered the rifle. He wasn't sure why. Something about the way she wasn't begging. He'd had men try to rob him twice in his life, and both of them had had a lot more to say for themselves than this woman did. "When did you last eat?" he asked. She blinked. Whatever she'd expected him to say, it wasn't that. "That's not your business," she said. "You're in my henhouse in the middle of the night, holding 2 of my eggs, so I'm going to say it is." A long pause. Outside, a coyote called from somewhere up toward the ridge, and the hens shuffled again at the sound of it. "Day before yesterday," she said. "I had some bread." Elias looked at her for another moment. Then he lowered the lantern slightly, so the light wasn't hitting her directly in the face. "Put the eggs down before you drop them," he said. "Come inside." She didn't move. "I'm not looking for charity. I didn't offer any. I offered you to come inside." He turned and walked back toward the house, and after a moment he heard her set the eggs down carefully in the straw and follow him. He made her sit at the kitchen table while he built the fire up and put a pan on. She sat with her hands in her lap and her back very straight, like she was in church or in a courtroom, like sitting at ease was something she'd forgotten how to do. He didn't ask questions while he cooked. He'd found in his years of living alone that people talked when they were ready to and not before, and that pushing them only made them close up tighter. He fried salt pork and eggs, including 2 from the henhouse, which he figured was fair enough, and cut bread and poured water. And when he set it all in front of her, he went back to the stove and kept his back turned so she could eat without him watching. He heard the fork scrape the plate, then silence, then the sound of bread being torn. She ate fast at first, the way hungry people eat, And then she slowed down the way people slow down when their body starts remembering what it feels like to have food in it and gets cautious about going too fast. When he heard her set the fork down, he poured 2 cups of coffee and brought them to the table and sat across from her. She looked different now. Not better, exactly, but more present. Like she'd been somewhere far away and had come part way back. "I'm Rosalie Mercer," she said. "My father was Henry Mercer. He had the ranch about 6 miles south of here, on the creek bottom." Elias had heard of Henry Mercer. Not well, the man had kept to himself mostly, but he knew the name and roughly where the property was. "Elias Boone," he said. "I know who you are." She wrapped both hands around the coffee cup. "You've got a reputation for being left alone." "So do you," he said, because he'd heard Rosalie Mercer's name too, though what he'd heard hadn't been kind and he hadn't put much stock in it either way. Her jaw tightened. "What have you heard?" "Nothing worth repeating." She studied him. "That means you've heard all of it." He didn't answer. "Silas Crow told the town I ran up debts my father couldn't pay," she said. "That I pressured a sick old man and drove him into financial ruin. That the reason he had to take the ranch was because of me." She said it in a completely flat tone, like she was reading from a page. "He told the dressmaker I had loose morals. He told the blacksmith my father was ashamed of me. He told the pastor," she stopped. "Doesn't matter what he told the pastor." "What's the truth?" Elias asked. She looked at him steadily. "My father had no debt. Crow manufactured it. He forged a document claiming my father owed him $800 against the ranch as collateral, and he presented it 10 days after my father died, when there was no one left to contradict him but me. And nobody believed you." "Nobody wanted to believe me," she said, which was a different thing. "Crow's been in this valley for 20 years. He owns the feed store, the lumber yard, and the note on half the farms between here and Billings. People don't argue with a man like that unless they've got nothing left to lose." "And you've got nothing left to lose," Elias said. "I've got 2 eggs," she said. "Or I did." It was the first time either of them had come close to something like humor, and it landed oddly in the quiet kitchen. Not quite funny, but not quite not. Elias drank his coffee. "What are you going to do?" "I don't know yet." She said it plainly, without self-pity, which he respected. "I've been turned away from 3 jobs in town. Those told people not to hire me. I've got no money, no place to sleep, and apparently no reputation worth arguing about." She paused. "I wasn't planning to steal your eggs. I was going to walk on. But I smelled the hens and She stopped again. "You were hungry," Elias said. "Yes." He showed her the small room off the back of the house that he'd always used for storage. It had a cot under a pile of old saddle blankets and a window with no glass but a good shutter, and it was warm enough in summer. "This isn't charity," he said, because she'd been very clear about that. "I've got fence line that needs mending on the north pasture, and my accounts haven't been kept in 4 months. I can pay you in room and board until we figure out something better." She looked at the room. She looked at him. "I cook," she said. "I tend animals. I keep accounts. I can fix a gate or a fence if I've got the tools." "Then we've got a deal," he said. She didn't shake his hand, and he didn't offer it. They just both understood it the same way, which was its own kind of agreement. She was asleep inside of 10 minutes. Elias knew, because he stood in the hall long enough to hear the cot creak and then go quiet. He went back to bed himself and lay awake for a while, looking at the ceiling, wondering what he'd just done. He didn't have an answer. He just knew that something about the way she'd held those eggs, careful, determined, like they were the last decent thing in her world, had gotten past the part of him that normally kept things out. She was up, before him in the morning, which surprised him. He came into the kitchen at 5:30 to find the fire already built, coffee already on, and Rosalie standing at the stove turning cornbread in a pan. She'd tied her hair back and changed into a dress that was slightly less patched than the one the night before, which meant she'd had a bag somewhere. He'd been too tired to ask where. "Sit down," she said without looking up. "It'll be ready in a minute." He sat. He wasn't a man who'd had breakfast made for him more than a handful of times in the last 10 years, and he found he didn't know quite what to do with himself while he waited. He ended up just sitting there with his coffee and watching her move around his kitchen, efficiently, without fuss, opening the right cabinet on the first try, like she'd already cataloged the whole room while he was sleeping. "How long were you out there before last night?" he asked. 3 weeks, she said. 3 weeks. Sleeping where I could. There was a church in town that let me stay 2 nights. She flipped the cornbread. Then Crow apparently mentioned to the Reverend that sheltering me was the same as disrespecting the law. That's not what the law says. No, she said. But it's what Crow says, and around here those tend to be the same thing. She set the cornbread on the table, along with a cloth, to keep it warm and sat across from him, which he hadn't expected. He'd assumed she'd eat standing or wait until he was done. I want to be clear about something, she said, putting both hands flat on the table. I'm grateful for last night. I'm not going to pretend I'm not. But I'm not going to be indebted to you either. And if there comes a point where I can't work off what I owe, I'll leave. All right, he said. And I'm not going to be quiet about what Crow did to my family just because I'm staying on your land. I'm still going to figure out a way to prove it. Elias cut into the cornbread. It was better than anything he'd made himself in recent memory. I didn't ask you to be quiet, he said. She watched him for a moment like she was waiting for the condition to appear. When it didn't, she seemed to relax about a quarter inch. Good cornbread, he said. I know, she said, and picked up her fork. The first week was careful. They moved around each other with the deliberate politeness of two people who hadn't chosen each other's company and weren't going to pretend they had. Elias worked the cattle and the horses and the equipment. Rosalie took the house, the animals, and the accounts. And what he found within about 2 days was that she was as good as she'd said she was. Better, maybe. She found a billing error in his feed accounts that had been costing him $3 a month for over a year. She fixed the latch on the goat pen that had been loose since winter with a piece of wire and a rock as a hammer because she couldn't find a real one. She renegotiated his standing order with the dry goods store in town by writing a letter so polite and so precise about the terms of the arrangement that the store owner agreed to a lower rate, apparently just because she'd made the argument so clearly he couldn't find a hole in it. Elias didn't say much about any of this, but he noticed. He noticed the way she worked without complaint, without stopping to be praised, without ever asking whether she was doing enough. She just did what needed doing, and then looked for what needed doing next. She'd grown up on a working ranch, that was clear, and she'd grown up knowing that work was its own reward, in the sense that it kept you alive, and that was reward enough. He noticed other things too, things he didn't examine very closely. The sound of her moving around the house in the early morning. The way she always left the coffee pot on the back burner, where he'd find it warm when he came in from the barn. The fact that she laughed sometimes at her own comments. A short private sound, like she found herself funnier than she expected. He kept his distance. So did she. It was a reasonable arrangement, and neither of them was inclined to disturb it. The second week was when it got harder. Rosalie had been in town to pick up supplies, just the dry goods. No lingering, and she came back quieter than she'd left and didn't say why. Elias waited her out. Eventually, after supper, she told him. Mrs. Holt spit on the ground in front of me, she said. At the store. In front of 4 other women. Elias put down his fork. She said I had a nerve showing my face in town, Rosalie continued. Her voice was even. Too even, the kind of even that takes a lot of work. She said it was bad enough I'd been stealing from good people without having the decency to disappear. She said that in front of people. She said it loud enough for the whole street to hear. Rosalie was looking at her plate. I didn't answer her. I paid for what I needed and I left. She paused. I wanted to answer her. What did you want to say? She looked up. I wanted to say that the only thing I've ever stolen was 2 eggs from a man who fed me in exchange, and that if Eleanor Holt's idea of theft is a starving woman taking 2 eggs, then she ought to look a little harder at who's really taking things from people in this valley. That's a good answer, Elias said. It wouldn't have helped. No, he agreed. But it's still a good answer. She pushed her food around the plate. They think I'm ridiculous, she said quietly. Not just dishonest. They look at me and they see. She stopped. Elias was quiet. He knew what she was trying to say. He'd seen how people looked at Rosalie in the brief encounters he'd had since she came to stay. He'd seen the way their eyes moved over her body, her weight, her worn clothes, the general impression of someone who didn't fit the shape that the valley had decided respectable women were supposed to fit, and the way they dismissed everything else about her before she'd spoken a word. He didn't know what to say about that. He was a man who'd spent most of his adult life avoiding other people, partly by choice, and partly because people had a way of reducing him to a single quality, the quiet one, the strange one, the one who'd never married, and he'd found it easier not to give them the chance. You're not ridiculous, he said. It wasn't eloquent. He knew it wasn't. But she looked up at him across the table, and something in her face shifted, Not dramatically, just slightly, the way a knot loosens a little, but doesn't come undone. I know that, she said. I just need to keep remembering it. The trouble arrived on a Thursday afternoon, the kind of bright hot afternoon that made everything look more normal than it was. Elias was mending harness in the shade of the barn when he heard the horses on the track. He knew before he looked up that it was going to be something bad, because there were too many of them, and they were coming too fast for a social call. 3 men. One of them he recognized immediately: Dale Pritchard, Crow's deputy, a man with small eyes and a large sense of his own importance. The other 2 were hands, hired muscle, the kind that ranches like Crow's kept around to emphasize points. Rosalie was in the kitchen. Elias put down the harness and walked out to meet them before they could get to the door. "Pritchard," he said. Pritchard pulled up and looked down at him with the particular expression of a man who's been told he has authority and is reminding everyone of it constantly. "Boone, I need to speak to the Mercer woman." "She's not available," Elias said. "This isn't a social call. She's wanted for theft. Specific theft 2 eggs from Amos Webb's place 3 weeks ago." He pulled a folded paper from his coat. "I've got authorization to." "Is that a warrant?" Elias asked. Pritchard paused. "It's an authorization. From a judge." Another pause. "From Mr. Crow's office." "That's not a warrant," Elias said. "A warrant comes from a judge. You know that, and I know that. So unless you've got a piece of paper with a judge's name on it, you don't have the right to step off that horse onto my property." One of the hands shifted. Pritchard's jaw tightened. "She's a thief," Pritchard said. "She's a woman who took 2 eggs 3 weeks ago when she was starving," Elias said. "If Amos Webb wants to press charges, he can go to the circuit judge and get a real warrant. And when he does, I'll have something to think about. Until then, get off my land." Pritchard looked past him toward the house. Elias moved 2 steps to the left, directly in his line of sight. "You're making a mistake," Pritchard said. "Wouldn't be my first," Elias said. There was a long moment where nobody moved and the horses stood with their ears turned back, catching the tension the way horses do. Then Pritchard pulled his reins and turned back down the track without another word, and the 2 hands followed him, and the sound of the hooves faded. Elias stood in the yard until they were gone. Then he went inside. Rosalie was standing at the kitchen window. She'd seen all of it. "You didn't have to do that," she said. "I know. Crow is going to make it worse for you." "Probably," he said. He picked up his coffee cup from the table. "Tell me about the tin box." She turned from the window. "How do you know about the tin box?" "You mentioned it once and didn't finish. I figured there was a reason." He sat down. "Tell me now." She sat across from him, slowly, like she was considering how much to say. Then she told him all of it. Her father had kept documents in a small tin box, the kind of box that hardware used to come in. Nothing that looked important from the outside. Inside, the original deed to the ranch, signed and witnessed by 3 men. A letter in her father's handwriting naming Rosalie as his heir and describing, in careful detail, the visits Crow had paid him in the last months of his life and the pressure he'd applied. And a ledger, old but clear, showing every payment the Mercer Ranch had ever made and every debt it had ever carried, none of which was to Silas Crow. When they came to evict me, Rosalie said, "I had the box hidden, or I thought I did. I put it under the floorboard in the bedroom, the one that always lifted a little, and I planned to come back for it." She stopped. "When I came back 2 days later, the floorboard had been pulled up, and the box was gone." "Pritchard?" Elias asked. "Had to be," she said. "Or one of Crow's men. Nobody else knew to look there." Elias was quiet for a moment. "Your father wrote down Crow's visits." "What he said." "The pressure." "Everything," Rosalie said. "My father was methodical. He kept records of everything, always had. He trusted paper more than memory." She pressed her lips together. "He always said if you wanted to know the truth about something, write it down while it's happening. Because memory is the first thing people try to take from you." Elias thought about that. "We need to find that box," he said. Rosalie looked at him. "Crow has it locked up somewhere on his property. I have no way to—" "I didn't say we had to get it tonight," Elias said. "I said we need to find it." He looked at her steadily. "Start with what you know. Who else knew about the box? Who else might have known your father was keeping records?" She thought. "Thomas Briggs. He was my father's neighbor for 20 years. He used to come for supper twice a month, right up until Papa got too sick to have company." She paused. "And there was a ranch hand, young man named Caleb Marsh. He worked for Crow, but he was at our place sometimes when Crow came around." She stopped. He was always uncomfortable, like he knew something he didn't want to know. Those are places to start, Elias said. Rosalie watched him. Why are you doing this? He thought about answering the practical way, because Crow had just sent his man onto Elias's property with a fake warrant, and that made it Elias's problem now whether he liked it or not. That was all true. But it wasn't quite the whole answer. Because your father kept good records, he said finally. And the kind of man who keeps good records deserves to have them count for something. It wasn't the whole answer either, but it was enough for now, and Rosalie seemed to understand that. She looked down at her coffee cup for a moment. Then she said, All right, Thomas Briggs first. He lives on the creek bottom about a mile east of the old property. We can go tomorrow, Elias said. In the morning, she said. Before the heat. In the morning, he agreed. Outside, the summer evening had finally started to cool, and somewhere across the dark pasture a night bird called once and then went quiet, and the ranch sat still around them, the way honest land sits still, patient and indifferent to the troubles of the people who claim to own it. Elias Boone had come out to his henhouse with a rifle expecting a fox. He'd found something considerably more complicated, and he was beginning to understand, in the slow, quiet way that men who don't examine themselves too closely come to understand things, that complicated wasn't necessarily a problem. It was just the shape of what came next. They left at first light, before the heat had a chance to settle into the valley and make everything miserable. Elias hitched the smaller wagon, the one-horse rig he used for errands,
because riding out together on horseback would have looked like something it wasn't, and he had no interest in giving the valley more to talk about than it already had.
Rosalie climbed up without help and sat with her hands in her lap and her back straight, watching the track ahead of them with the expression of a woman who was doing what needed doing and had decided not to think too hard about anything else. They didn't talk much on the way to Thomas Briggs's place. The morning was still cool enough that the air smelled like grass and creek water, and the sky was doing that pale gold thing it did in Montana in summer before the sun got serious about its work. Elias kept his eyes on the horses and let the quiet be what it was. It was Rosalie who broke it, about 2 miles out. He might not want to talk, she said. Briggs. He's not a coward, but he's practical. He's got a wife and 2 grown sons working the same land, and Crow holds the note on his north pasture. Then we won't pressure him, Elias said. I'm not saying pressure. I'm saying prepare yourself. I'm prepared. She glanced at him sidelong. You're very calm about all of this. Anxious doesn't help, he said. She turned back to the track. No, she said, I suppose it doesn't. Briggs's property was tidy in the way of a man who'd worked the same land for 30 years and knew every inch of it. The house was weathered but sound, and there were chickens in the yard and a good kitchen garden behind a straight fence. A man was splitting wood behind the barn mid-60s, solid through the shoulders. The kind of man who moved like labor was just a fact of life, and not something to make a production of. He looked up when he heard the wagon. His face went through 2 or 3 things in quick succession when he recognized Rosalie, surprise, discomfort, something that might have been guilt, before he settled into the careful blankness of a man deciding how to handle an unexpected situation. Rosalie, he said. Mr. Briggs. She climbed down from the wagon before Elias had fully stopped it. This is Elias Boone. He's been letting me work his ranch. Briggs looked at Elias. Elias nodded. I've heard of you, Briggs said. His voice was neutral. Not unfriendly, but not open either. I'd like to talk about my father, Rosalie said. Straight to it, no preamble. Elias noted that about her. She didn't waste time on approaches when she knew what she wanted. Briggs set down his axe. He didn't say yes and he didn't say no. He said, Come in, Martha's got coffee. Martha Briggs was a small woman with quick eyes who assessed Rosalie in about 3 seconds and made some private decision that resulted in a plate of biscuits appearing on the table before anyone had sat down. Elias didn't know what the decision was, but he was grateful for the biscuits. They sat at a table that had seen 20 years of meals, and it showed, and Briggs put both hands around his coffee cup and looked at Rosalie the way men look at something they've been avoiding thinking about. I should have come to you, he said, after your father died. I kept meaning to. You didn't come, Rosalie said. Not accusatory, just fact. No, he looked at his coffee. Crow made it plain that anyone who associated with you would have trouble with their accounts. I've got sons, Rosalie. I've got a wife. I'm not young enough to start over if I lose this place. I understand that, she said, and she said it like she meant it, which surprised Elias a little. He hadn't expected her to make it easy for the man. But you came here anyway, Briggs said. So something's changed. We're building a case, Elias said. The debt Crow claimed against Henry Mercer doesn't appear in any of the family's financial records. The date on the note is suspicious. We need witnesses who can speak to Henry's condition and his finances in the last year of his life. Briggs looked at him carefully. You're not law. No. You're just a rancher. Yes. So what good is a case without law behind it? We're working on the law part, Elias said. Right now we're working on the truth part, and we figure truth is a decent place to start. Briggs was quiet for a moment. Martha refilled the coffee cups without being asked, which Elias took as a sign that she at least was leaning their way. Henry was sick, Briggs said finally. The fall before he died, he could barely get out of bed some days. His joints had gone bad, some kind of inflammation that hit him hard. He was taking laudanum for the pain. He looked at Rosalie. You know all this. I know it, she said. I need you to be willing to say it. Crow's note is dated October 14th, Elias said. Last year. Briggs went still. What is it? Rosalie said. October 14th, Briggs repeated slowly. That's the day Henry's younger brother came through. Frank, from over near Great Falls. Henry hadn't seen him in 3 years, and they sat up half the night. He looked at Elias. I know because I was there for supper that evening. Henry was stopped. He was having a bad day. A very bad day. His hands were so swollen he couldn't hold his fork. Frank had to cut his meat for him. The kitchen went quiet. He couldn't have ridden to Crow's office, Rosalie said. He couldn't have ridden to the end of his own lane, Briggs said. He said it with the weight of a man who understood exactly what it meant. The note is a lie. If it says Henry Mercer signed anything in Billings on October 14th, it's a flat lie. Will you say that? Rosalie asked, in front of a judge. Briggs looked at his hands, then at Martha. Martha gave him a look that was not complicated and not long, just a steady look that seemed to carry a lot of previously discussed information in it. He looked back at Rosalie. I've also got something else, he said quietly. Something I should have given you months ago and didn't, and I'm not proud of that. He got up and went to the back of the house. They heard a drawer open, then close. When he came back, he had an envelope in his hand, folded twice, with Rosalie's name written on the front in handwriting she recognized before he even held it out. Her face changed. He gave it to me last summer, Briggs said. Said to keep it safe and give it to you if anything happened to him. He paused. He said he hoped you'd never need it, but he wanted you to have it just in case. Rosalie took the envelope from him. Her hands weren't quite steady. She didn't open it at the table. Elias understood instinctively that she wouldn't want to do that in front of anyone, even people who meant well, but she held it with both hands against her chest, not unlike the way she'd held those 2 eggs in his henhouse, and for just a moment her composure cracked, not completely, just enough that you could see what was underneath it. Then she straightened up and pressed her lips together, and it was gone. Thank you, she said. Her voice was level. I mean that. I should have come sooner, Briggs said again. You're here now, she said. And again she said it, like she meant it. They were halfway back to the main road when Rosalie opened the envelope. Elias kept his eyes on the horses and let her read. She read slowly, turning the pages carefully, and he heard the paper rustle, and then go quiet, and then rustle again. It took a while. Whatever her father had written, it wasn't short. When she was done, she folded it back up and put it in her pocket, and sat looking at the track ahead of them for a long moment. He knew, she said finally. He knew what Crow was planning. He wrote it down every visit, every conversation, every threat. Crow told him he'd die a rich man if he sold the ranch voluntarily, and he'd die leaving his daughter nothing if he didn't. She stopped. My father told him he'd rather die broke than sell to a man who made threats against his child. Elias didn't say anything. He didn't figure anything he could say would be adequate. He documented everything, she said. Names, date, what was said, what was offered. He even wrote down that he'd put the deed and a copy of this letter in the tin box, just in case. She exhaled. He was more afraid of what Crow would do after he was gone than of dying itself. He was afraid he wouldn't be there to protect me. He protected you, Elias said quietly. He just used paper instead of a gun. She looked at him. Something moved in her face that he couldn't quite name. Yes, she said, he did. Finding Caleb Marsh was harder. Elias knew the name most people in the valley did. In the vague way you know the names of young men who work the big ranches and mostly stay out of trouble. Caleb Marsh was 23 or 24, lean and dark-haired, and from what Elias had heard, he was the kind of young man who kept his head down and did what he was told, and tried not to think too hard about the things he saw. The trouble was locating him without alerting Crow that someone was looking. Rosalie solved this in a way that Elias wouldn't have thought of, which was by asking Martha Briggs before they left, because Martha knew everything about everyone in a 30-mile radius and understood exactly why they needed to find Caleb without anyone knowing they'd looked. Martha told them Caleb Marsh ate lunch at the feed store in town every Tuesday, at the table by the window, because the feed store owner's wife made a decent meal deal, and Caleb was the kind of young man who ate the same lunch at the same place every week out of habit and economy. It was Monday. They had a day to wait. Rosalie spent that day reading her father's letter 3 more times, not out of grief, or not only out of grief, but in the methodical way she did everything, building a mental catalog of every name mentioned, every date recorded, every piece of the story that could be confirmed or corroborated. Elias found her at the kitchen table that evening, with the letter laid out flat and a piece of paper beside it where she'd been making notes in her careful handwriting. He mentioned a man named Orson Webb, she said when he came in. Not Amos Webb Orson, Amos's father. He says Orson Webb told him directly that Crow had pressured him to testify falsely in a property dispute 8 years ago, that there was a pattern to this. Orson Webb is still alive? According to my father's letter, yes, though he'd be old. In his 80s, she paused. He might not talk. He might not, Elias agreed. But he's there, she said, and what he knows is there with him. Elias pulled out the chair across from her and sat. He studied her notes for a moment, names down the left margin, dates beside them, questions marked with a small circle. It was organized the way a legal brief might be organized, which told him something about how her mind worked. You've done this kind of thinking before, he said. My father taught me. He said a woman who can't manage her own affairs is a woman who depends on someone else's goodwill, and that goodwill runs out. She picked up her pencil. He wasn't wrong. No, Elias said. He wasn't. He got up and poured 2 cups of coffee and brought them back and sat down again. It felt like the most natural thing in the world, which was something he tried not to think about too carefully. Tuesday arrived slow the way Tuesdays do. Elias went to town alone. Rosalie had wanted to come, and they'd argued about it quietly over breakfast, not a real argument, more of a firm exchange of differing positions. And Elias had eventually pointed out that if Caleb Marsh saw Rosalie before he had a chance to talk to him, the young man would likely bolt before any conversation could happen, given that everyone in the valley knew Rosalie Mercer was the kind of trouble that could get a person crosswise with Silas Crow. Rosalie had not liked this reasoning, but she'd accepted it. Don't push him, she said, when Elias was getting the horse ready. If he's scared, pushing will just shut him down. I know, Elias said. And don't, she stopped. Just don't be more intimidating than you have to be. He looked at her. You think I'm intimidating? She gave him a look that said she thought he was occasionally oblivious. You're 6 feet tall, and you carry yourself like you've never needed to apologize to anyone in your life. Yes, I think you can be intimidating. He thought about this. I'll sit down first, he said. So he's not looking up at me. That's yes. That's good, she said, with a slight expression that suggested she hadn't expected him to take the practical advice. He found Caleb Marsh exactly where Martha Briggs had said he'd be, at the table by the feed store window, with a plate of beans and salt pork in front of him and his hat on the chair beside him. He was a slight young man with careful eyes and the particular look of someone who was always aware of the exits. Elias went in, ordered a coffee, and sat down at Caleb's table without asking. Caleb's hand went toward his hat like he was getting ready to leave. I'm not from Crow, Elias said. I'm Elias Boone. I've got a ranch about 6 miles north of the old Mercer property. Caleb went still. I know who you are, he said. You took her in. She's working for me, Elias said. There's a difference. Not to Crow, there isn't. No, Elias said. Probably not. He drank his coffee. I'm not going to take up much of your time. I just need to know one thing. Caleb looked at him from under lowered brows. What thing? The tin box. The one from the Mercer property during the eviction. Elias kept his voice level, unhurried. Did you see what happened to it? Whatever Caleb had expected him to ask, it wasn't that. His face went through something complicated, surprise, calculation, and then a flash of something that looked uncomfortably like relief. The kind of relief that comes from someone finally asking the question you've been waiting for someone to ask. Then it locked back down. I don't know what you're talking about, he said. Caleb. Elias set his cup down. I'm not asking you to do anything right now. I'm not asking you to talk to anyone or sign anything or go anywhere. I'm just asking if you know what happened to the box." The young man was quiet. He was staring at his beans, not eating them. "Pritchard took it," he said finally, so quietly Elias almost missed it. "I saw him come out of the bedroom with it. He put it under his coat. He didn't say what it was, and I didn't ask, because I'd learned by then that the things I didn't ask about were the things that didn't blow back on me." "Where is it now?" Elias asked. Caleb's jaw tightened. "Locked cabinet. Back office in Crow's main house. I've seen the cabinet. I've never seen what's in it. But you think—" "I don't think anything," Caleb said. "I'm telling you what I saw, what Pritchard did. That's all I know." "That's enough," Elias said. "For now, that's enough." Caleb looked at him with those careful eyes. "For now," he repeated. Elias left him with the check paid and his beans going cold and took the road back out of town at a steady pace, not hurrying, not looking back. He told Rosalie everything on the drive back. She listened without interrupting, which was unusual for her, and when he finished she was quiet for a long moment. "Crow's main house is 3 miles east of my father's property," she said. "I know where it is. The cabinet is locked." "Most locked things have keys," Elias said. She looked at him with an expression he was getting to know the one she used when he said something she agreed with but hadn't expected him to say. "You're not suggesting." "I'm not suggesting anything tonight," he said. "First we need to know more. The cabinet, the layout of the house, whether Crow has night men." He kept his eyes on the road. "And first we need a lawyer." "A lawyer," she said. "One who isn't afraid of Crow, which means one who isn't from around here." She thought about that. "Billings," she said. "There's a man in Billings. My father mentioned him once. Nathaniel Cole. He'd handled a land dispute case against one of the big cattle operations and he'd won." "Then we go to Billings," Elias said. "It's a day's ride." "Then we ride a day," he said simply, as if distance were just another kind of fence that you got to the other side of by moving your feet. They rode back to the ranch in the early afternoon heat, the sun pressing down on everything with the particular indifference of Montana summer. And somewhere behind them, the town went about its business. And somewhere in a locked cabinet in Crow's back office, a tin box sat with everything Rosalie needed to take back what was hers. They prepared for 2 days before Billings. Rosalie gathered everything she had: her father's letter from Briggs, her own notes, a rough ledger she'd reconstructed from memory with every financial transaction she could recall from the ranch's history. Elias went over the numbers twice, checking her figures against his own knowledge of property values and loan rates in the valley, because if they were going to walk into a lawyer's office, they needed to walk in with something that looked like a case, and not just a grievance. On the second evening, he found her in the barn, long after dark, sitting on an upturned bucket beside the mare, not doing anything in particular, just sitting. The mare had her nose down by Rosalie's shoulder and wasn't moving, which told Elias something about the horse's read on the situation. "You all right?" he asked. "I'm fine." "You're in the barn at 9 o'clock, he said. "People go to the barn at 9 o'clock when they're either working or they don't want to be where anyone can see them." She didn't answer right away. The mare shifted her weight and huffed softly. "What if the lawyer can't help?" Rosalie said. "What if we get all the way to Billings with everything we have, and he looks at it and says it's not enough, or that it's too dangerous to take on?" She paused. "Or what if we can never get the box? Then we figure out what comes next," Elias said. "That's not a plan." "No," he agreed. "But it's the truth." He sat down on the hay bale across from her. "You've been living on nothing but staying alive for 3 weeks. Before that, you were watching your father die while Crow circled the place like a buzzard. You've been holding all of this together with your hands for months now, and you're still holding it." He looked at her directly. "The question isn't whether you can handle it if the lawyer says no. You already know you can. The question is whether you can let yourself believe that it might actually go right." She looked at him across the dim barn for a moment. "That's unexpectedly perceptive," she said. "I have my moments," he said, straight-faced. She almost smiled. Not quite, but it was close enough that he counted it. "My father used to say the hardest part of fighting for something isn't the fighting," she said. "It's the waiting, the not knowing. The part where you've done everything you can do and you're just waiting to find out if it was enough." He was right, Elias said. He usually was, she said. Except about his health. He was always convinced he'd outlast the problem. She said it gently, without bitterness, with the particular tenderness people use when they've had enough time to get to the other side of grief, and can finally say the hard things the gentle way. The mare snorted, and Rosalie reached up without looking and scratched her neck in the exact right spot, which made the mare lean into it. She likes you, Elias said. Horses usually do, Rosalie said. They don't care about my weight or whether Silas Crow has decided I'm disposable. They just care whether you're calm and whether your hands are gentle. Elias was quiet a moment. Most things worth caring about work that way, he said. She looked at him. He didn't look away. It was just a moment. Just two tired people in a barn at 9 o'clock while a horse breathed slow beside them. But it was the kind of moment that has weight to it, the kind you know you'll remember later without being able to say exactly what you were feeling during it. Rosalie looked away first. We should get some sleep, she said. Long ride tomorrow. Yes, he said. He stood up. Leave the lantern. I'll close up. She handed it to him and walked back to the house, and Elias stood in the barn for a minute after she was gone, listening to the mare settle and the night insects start up outside, and thought about nothing in particular, which was what he always told himself when he didn't want to examine what he was actually thinking. They left for Billings in the blue hour before sunrise, with enough provisions for 2 days and the letter and notes wrapped in oilcloth in Rosalie's bag. The road out of the valley was clear and empty at that hour, and they made good time in the cool of the morning. By the time they stopped to water the horses at noon, they'd covered more than half the distance, and Elias had started to feel cautiously like things might actually go in the right direction. That was when they saw Pritchard. He was coming the other way, on the Billings Road, with 2 men behind him. He pulled up when he recognized Elias's horse, and the 3 of them blocked the road with the practiced ease of men who'd done it before. Rosalie went rigid beside him. Boone, Pritchard said. Heading to Billings? That's generally what the Billings Road is for, Elias said. Pritchard's eyes moved to Rosalie. You've got a lot of nerve, he said to her, traveling around this county like a free woman after what you've done. I haven't done anything, she said. Her voice was calm, and Elias could tell it cost her something to keep it that way. You've been telling lies about Mr. Crow to half the valley, Pritchard said, stirring up old grievances, making accusations against a respectable man. He leaned forward on his saddle. Mr. Crow is a patient man, but patience has limits. Tell Mr. Crow, Elias said, that his patience is his own concern, and this road is a public road and we'll be on our way. I'm talking to the woman, Pritchard said. You're talking to whoever I decide you're talking to on a road I'm using, Elias said, and something in his voice changed just enough, dropped quiet, went flat that Pritchard's horse actually shifted back a step. The 2 men behind Pritchard looked at each other. Pritchard's jaw worked. You keep this up, he said. You're going to lose more than fence line. My fence line burned, Elias said steadily. I haven't forgotten that. And I haven't decided yet what I'm going to do about it. That landed. He watched it land. Pritchard knew that Elias knew who was responsible for the barn. And now Pritchard knew that Elias knew, which was a different and less comfortable situation than having done it to a man who decided to stay quiet. Clear the road, Elias said. Another moment. Then Pritchard pulled aside, and his 2 men pulled aside, and Elias drove the wagon past without looking at them. And Rosalie stared straight ahead with her hands folded in her lap and her jaw set, and neither of them spoke until the sound of those horses was well behind them. He'll report back to Crow, Rosalie said. Yes, Elias said. Crow will know we went to Billings. He'll guess why too, Elias said. Which means we need whatever Nathaniel Cole can give us, and we need it fast. She exhaled. Do you think he'll try to stop us from getting back? Elias considered this honestly. He might try, he said. But trying and doing are different things, and we've got something Crow doesn't expect us to have. What's that? He kept his eyes on the road, everything your father wrote down. Rosalie sat with that for a moment. Then she unfolded her hands in her lap and straightened her back and looked at the road ahead of them with the expression of a woman who has decided that fear is a reasonable response to a bad situation, but not a useful one, and that useful was what she intended to be. The horses moved steady on the road to Billings, and the valley dropped behind them, and whatever Silas Crow decided to do next would have to wait until they were ready to meet it. Nathaniel Cole's office was on the 2nd floor of a narrow building on Montana Avenue, wedged between a printer's shop and a land surveyor's office. And it smelled like old paper and pipe tobacco, and the particular kind of ambition that doesn't have anywhere comfortable to sit down. The man himself was younger than Elias had expected, mid-40s, with wire-rimmed glasses and a thin face that looked like it had been designed for skepticism and had been used for it extensively. He was reading when they came in, and he finished his sentence before he looked up, which Elias took as either rudeness or professionalism, and decided to reserve judgment. He looked at Rosalie first, then at Elias, then back at Rosalie. "Miss Mercer," he said. "I wondered when someone would come." Rosalie stopped. "You know who I am?" "I know the Mercer property filing," Cole said. He set his book down and took off his glasses and cleaned them with a cloth from his desk drawer with the methodical patience of a man who did it 20 times a day. "I know the debt claim Silas Crow filed against the estate. I know it was processed with remarkable speed by a probate clerk who has since been promoted to a better-paying position in Crow's feed operation." He put the glasses back on. "I've been watching Crow's land acquisitions for 3 years. Sit down." They sat. Cole listened without interrupting while Rosalie laid it out everything, in the order she'd organized it, with the letter from her father set on his desk where he could see it. He didn't touch it at first. He just listened, and his face did nothing that gave away what he was thinking, which Elias found professionally impressive and personally irritating. When she finished, Cole picked up the letter. He read it slowly, twice, with the glasses close to the page. "The date on Crow's note," he said. "October 14th. "Thomas Briggs can testify my father was bedridden that day," Rosalie said. "He was there." "Briggs will testify?" He said he would. Cole set the letter down. "The notary's seal on the debt note," he said. "I've been looking at it since the filing came through, and something about it has bothered me. The impression is slightly off-center, in a way that's consistent with a stamp being used without the original mounting block." He looked at Rosalie over the glasses. "In plain language, it looks like someone pressed a stolen seal into wax, rather than using the proper notary press." The room went quiet. "You think it's forged," Elias said. "I think I want to find the notary whose name appears on it and ask him directly," Cole said. "His name is Edmund Ferris. He practiced in Billings until about 14 months ago. He retired and moved to his daughter's property near Missoula. He was already writing on a notepad. I know someone who knows him. I can have a letter out today." "How long will that take?" Rosalie asked. "A week. Maybe 2. He looked at her steadily. "Miss Mercer, I want to be clear with you about something. If the seal is forged, and if Briggs will testify, and if this letter can be authenticated, you have the foundation of a legitimate federal land fraud case. That is not a small thing. Federal cases take time, and they require corroboration that is bulletproof, because Crow will have expensive lawyers who will attack every weakness in the evidence." "I understand that," she said. "Do you understand that Crow will know you came here? He'll escalate. He'll make things harder for anyone connected to you. He's already burned Elias's barn," she said. Cole looked at Elias. "Your barn. Part of it," Elias said, "and took some notes I'd been keeping." "You were documenting," Cole said. "I was," Elias said. "From memory now." Cole wrote something else on his notepad. "All right," he said, in the tone of a man who has made a decision and moved past the deciding part of it. "Here's what we do. I write to Ferris today about the seal. You go back and you keep building your witness list. Anyone who can speak to Henry Mercer's condition, his finances, his character. Anyone who has seen Crow use similar pressure before." He paused. "And the tin box." "We know where it is," Rosalie said. "Getting it legally would be better than getting it otherwise," Cole said. "We know," Elias said. Cole looked at him with the particular look of a lawyer who has heard the word "we know" used, in a way that suggested the people saying it were considering options he'd rather not have officially described to him. "I'll be in touch in 2 weeks," he said. "Don't do anything that gives Crow cause to have either of you arrested before then." "We'll do our best," Rosalie said. "That," Cole said, "is exactly what I'm afraid of." The ride back from Billings took the better part of the next day, and they made it without encountering Pritchard or anyone else who looked like trouble, which should have been a relief, but instead felt like the particular quiet before a weather change not reassuring so much as temporary. They got home late afternoon to find that someone had been on the property. Elias knew it before he got the horses unhitched. Small things: the barn latch not quite the way he'd left it, a bucket moved 2 feet from where he kept it, nothing dramatic. Just the systematic examination of a man's space by someone who'd wanted to be subtle and hadn't quite managed it. He went through the house while Rosalie stood in the doorway, watching him. The desk had been gone through, drawers put back in the wrong order by a fraction. The notes he'd been keeping in the kitchen, his reconstructed accounts, the dates and names he'd written out from memory, were gone. He stood in the middle of the kitchen and looked at where they'd been. "They took the notes," he said. Rosalie came inside. She looked at the empty spot on the shelf where the papers had been. Her face went flat in the way it did when she was angry and controlling it. "They went through your whole house," she said. "They were looking for whatever we'd found," Elias said. "They know we went to Billings, and they wanted to know what we came back with." "The letter," Rosalie said quickly. Her hand went to her bag. "You had that with you," Elias said. They didn't get it. She exhaled. She sat down at the kitchen table and put the bag on her lap and held it there with both hands. And Elias understood that she was holding it the way people hold things that are the last of something irreplaceable. "We need to get the box," she said. "We need to be smart about how we get it." Cole said legally would be better. She looked up at him. But Cole also said 2 weeks. In 2 weeks, Crow could move that box. He could destroy it. If he suspects we've been to Billings, if he thinks we're building a case, he won't destroy it, Elias said. He sat down across from her. "That box has the original deed in it. Even forged or not, Crow needs that deed to defend his claim to the property. If he destroys it, he loses his own evidence." She thought about that. "So he'll keep it. He'll keep it, and he'll guard it better than he has been," Elias said. "Which means we don't have 2 weeks. We probably have 1. Rosalie looked at him across the kitchen table. The afternoon light was coming in sideways through the window, the way it did in late summer, when the sun had moved south enough to cut at an angle, and it made everything in the room look more provisional than it usually did. Like the light itself knew things were in the balance. "You're thinking about going in after it," she said. "I'm thinking about having a conversation with Caleb Marsh," Elias said carefully. "Because Caleb Marsh works at Crow's main house and knows the layout, and Caleb Marsh has already told me more than he intended to." "He's scared," Rosalie said. "I told you don't push." "I'm not going to push him," Elias said. "I'm going to give him something he's been needing for a while." "What's that?" "A reason to be on the right side of this," Elias said. "Because right now he's on Crow's side out of fear and economics, and neither of those is a good enough reason for a young man to carry what he's clearly been carrying." Rosalie was quiet for a moment. "You're better at people than you let on," she said. "I'm not particularly good at people," he said. "I've just had a lot of time to think about what makes them move." Caleb Marsh wasn't at the feed store on Wednesday. He wasn't anywhere visible in town. And when Elias rode past Crow's main property on the long way home, he could see extra horses at the hitching post that hadn't been there before, and 2 men on the porch who should have had men being paid to stand there rather than men who had a reason to. Crow was tightening things up. Elias came home and told Rosalie, and they sat at the kitchen table and thought about it, the way people think about problems that have a clock on them. "He won't come to town," Rosalie said. "Crow has probably told everyone on the property to stay put." "So we go to him," Elias said. "How carefully?" He looked at the table. "You said Caleb was uncomfortable. When Crow came around your father's place with him along, you said he looked like a man who knew things he didn't want to know." "Yes." "Where did you get that read on him? What specifically?" Rosalie thought back. "There was a visit late September, maybe a month before my father died. Crow came to talk about the property. My father was having a good day, and he was sharp, and he told Crow exactly what he thought of him, and Crow smiled through all of it the way he does. Like everything anyone says to him just confirms what he already knows about his own superiority." She paused. "But Caleb was standing by the horses the whole time, and at one point my father said something. He said, 'I've got it all written down, Silas. Every word you've said to me. And when I'm gone, my daughter will know exactly who you are.'" And Crow just smiled. "But Caleb," she stopped. "What did Caleb do?" Elias asked. "He looked at the house," she said. "He looked at the house like he was memorizing it. And he looked at me." Her voice was quiet now. "He looked at me the way a person looks at someone they feel sorry for, when they know something bad is coming and they can't stop it." She was still for a moment. "I didn't understand it at the time. I thought it was just discomfort. But now I think he knew even then what Crow was planning to do. And he's been living with that knowledge," Elias said. "For months." Elias sat back. "There's a creek that runs along the east side of Crow's property. You can follow it from the Briggs line without being visible from the main house." Rosalie looked at him carefully. "You've been thinking about this for a while." "I looked at the lay of the land when we rode out to Briggs," he said. "Old habit." "What kind of old habit?" He gave her a brief look that suggested the answer to, that was more history than she needed right now. "I'll go at first light tomorrow," he said. "The hands ride out to the east pasture before 7. There'll be a window." "I'm going with you," she said. "Rosalie, it's my land," she said. "My father's letter. My name on that deed." "I'm going." She said it without heat, without drama, just in the flat, steady tone that he'd learned, meant there was no point in arguing, because she'd already finished the argument in her own head and reached the conclusion she intended to reach. He looked at her for a moment. Then he said, "Wear dark clothes. And boots, not shoes. I own one pair of shoes," she said. "Boots, then." They went before sunrise. The creek path was rougher than it looked, and noisier than either of them wanted dry grass crackling underfoot, a branch that snapped too loud, somewhere in the dark, but they moved as carefully as they could, and the property stayed quiet around them. The sky was barely gray when they reached the stand of cottonwoods at the edge of the creek bend, where the east fence of Crow's property started. From there they could see the back of the main house. 2 lamps on inside kitchen and one other. Smoke from the kitchen chimney. Someone up early. They waited. At 6:15, the bunkhouse door opened, and 4 men came out and went to the barn, and came out again with horses and rode east, without looking toward the creek. A 5th man came out of the kitchen door of the main house with a coffee cup, and stood on the back steps for a few minutes and then went back inside. Caleb Marsh came around the side of the house at 6:30, with a bucket, heading for the well. He was alone. Elias looked at Rosalie. She nodded. He moved out of the cottonwoods and along the fence line, low and quiet, and got to within 20 feet of Caleb before the young man heard something and spun around. "It's Boone," Elias said quickly, soft. "Don't call out." Caleb's face went white. His eyes went to the house, and then back to Elias, and then, when he registered Rosalie coming up behind, back to the house again. "Are you out of your mind?" he said, barely above a whisper. "If Crow's men see you here, they rode east 6 minutes ago," Elias said. "How long do they usually stay out?" Caleb's jaw worked. 2-3 hours, depends. "Then we've got time," Elias said. "Caleb, I need to ask you something, and I need you to think carefully before you answer." "I already told you what I know," Caleb said. "You told me about the box," Elias said. "Now I need to know about the cabinet." Caleb looked at him. He was gripping the bucket handle with both hands, knuckles pale. "What about it?" "The key," Elias said. "Where does Crow keep it?" A long silence. A bird called somewhere in the cottonwoods behind them, loud in the quiet morning. "Caleb," Rosalie said. She moved up beside Elias, and something about her being there, the fact of her size and her steadiness, and the direct way she looked at him, seemed to change something in the young man's posture. "He stole my father's land, not borrowed it, not bought it. Stole it with a forged note and a stolen seal and a document signed with a dead man's name." Her voice was quiet but not gentle. "You know that. You've known it for a long time. And you've been carrying it, and it's been heavy, and I think you are tired." Caleb's eyes went to the ground. "He keeps it on his watch chain," he said. "Small brass key. He never takes the chain off, not even to sleep." He looked up. "You can't get it from him directly. You'd have to." He stopped. "Is there a copy?" Elias asked. "I don't." Caleb stopped again. Swallowed. "There's a locksmith in Billings who made the cabinet. I was with Pritchard when he picked it up. The locksmith gave Pritchard 2 keys, and Pritchard gave them both to Crow." He looked at Elias. "But locksmith shops keep records. They keep records of every lock and key they make, for exactly the reason you're thinking." Elias looked at Rosalie. "He keeps records," she said. "It's a standard practice," Caleb said. "So if a key is lost, they can make another one from the original cut." His voice was low and fast now, like he'd decided to say this before he could stop himself. "The locksmith's name is Halverson. His shop is on First Street in Billings, South Side. He's been in business 30 years, and he's not a Crow man. He's not anyone's man. He just does his work." "Caleb," Elias said. "When this is over, when there's a federal hearing, and they're looking for witnesses who can speak to what happened at the Mercer eviction, will you be there?" The young man was quiet for so long that Elias thought he was going to say no. "I've got nowhere else to go," Caleb said finally. "If I testify against Crow, I've got no job and probably no reference and nowhere to go." "I've got a ranch that needs a second hand," Elias said. "It doesn't pay much, but it's honest work." Caleb looked at him, then at Rosalie, then back at Elias. "I'll think about it," he said. "That's all I'm asking," Elias said. They went back the way they came, through the cottonwoods and along the creek in the gray early morning, and neither of them spoke until they were well clear of the property. "Halverson's locksmith," Rosalie said. "First Street." "We go back to Billings," Elias said. "We talk to Cole first. Tell him what we've learned about the notary seal and the locksmith. We do this right. And if Cole gets a response from Ferris about the forged seal, then we've got the notary fraud confirmed," Elias said. "And the witness list from Briggs and Caleb, and the letter, and the locksmith's key record. He kept moving through the grass. That's a case, Rosalie. She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "We need to go back before Crow knows we've been to see Caleb." "We'll go tomorrow," he said. "Tonight I want to check the property and make sure nobody's paid us another visit." But they hadn't even reached the wagon before they saw the smoke. Not a lot of it, not a burning, not a disaster, just a thin gray column rising from the direction of the ranch, the kind of smoke that meant something small and deliberate, not an accident. Elias moved faster. Rosalie moved with him. They got back to find the barn's east wall scorched from the base up to about shoulder height, not burned through, but damage serious enough to weaken the boards, serious enough to send a message. Whoever had done it hadn't wanted to burn the barn down. They'd wanted to make sure Elias knew they could. On the ground in front of the barn door, weighted down by a rock, was a piece of paper. Elias picked it up. It said, "Last warning," 2 words. No signature. Rosalie read it over his shoulder. "He knows we went to Crow's property this morning," she said. "Maybe," Elias said. "Or this was already planned and waiting for us to come home and find it." He looked at the scorched wall. Either way, it's the same message. He stood there for a moment, holding the paper, looking at his barn, and Rosalie stood beside him without saying anything, which he appreciated. Some moments needed to be felt before they could be acted on. Then he folded the paper and put it in his coat pocket. "We need to move faster than we planned," he said. "Billings today," she said. "Billings today," he said. "And tonight I want you to write down everything, every name, every date, everything in your father's letter on 2 separate copies. You keep one, Cole keeps one, and we don't keep anything here that can be taken. And the tin box?" He looked at the barn again. The scorched wood smell was sharp in the morning air. "Cole has to know the full picture before we move on the box," he said. "But I think after today, after this—" He stopped. "What?" she said. "I think Crow is starting to be afraid," Elias said. "And frightened men with power don't wait. They accelerate." He looked at her. "Which means we need to accelerate too." Rosalie looked at the paper in his pocket, then at the scorched wall, then at him. "Then stop talking and hitch the horse," she said. Cole read the piece of paper without expression and set it on his desk next to the letter from Ferris that had arrived faster than expected, 3 days ahead of schedule by the morning mail. Elias hadn't known about the letter from Ferris until Cole held it up. "He wrote back already," Cole said. "Edmund Ferris, retired notary, currently of Missoula. He says," he put on his glasses and read from the letter. "He says he absolutely did not notarize any document for Silas Crow in October of last year. He says the last document he notarized for Crow was in the spring of 1885, regarding a lumber purchase, and that he has the record. He says he would be willing to testify to this under oath." Cole set the letter down. The seal was forged. Definitively. Rosalie's hand went flat on the armrest of her chair. "That's the foundation," Cole said. "Forged notary seal on the central document of a property fraud case. That's not circumstantial. That's direct evidence of criminal misconduct." He looked at them both over the glasses. "Now, tell me about this locksmith." Elias told him about Halverson. Cole wrote it down. When Elias finished, Cole put his pen down and looked at the desk for a moment. "If Halverson's records show the key cut for that cabinet," he said, "and if we can compel production of what's inside the cabinet through a federal order, we won't need to go in and get the box ourselves." "Can you get that order?" Rosalie asked. "Not quickly," Cole said. "Federal orders take time. But I have a contact at the Territorial Marshal's office who has been interested in Crow's land dealings for reasons that have nothing to do with your case." He paused. "If I bring him in, the timeline shortens considerably." "What does he get?" Elias asked. "He gets Crow," Cole said simply. "Your case isn't the only one. There are 2 other families in that valley who've lost property to Crow's notes in the last 4 years. If your evidence cracks the first case, the others follow." He looked at Rosalie. "You may be the one who opens the door, but you won't be the only one walking through it." Rosalie was quiet for a moment. "How long?" she asked. "For the marshal's order? If my contact moves quickly, 10 days, possibly 2 weeks. And in 10 days, Crow could move the box," she said. "Or destroy it," Elias said. "He won't destroy the deed," Cole said, echoing what Elias had told Rosalie days ago. "But he might move the box to somewhere less accessible." He thought for a moment. "This is the difficult part. We need that box intact and in place when the order comes through, so the contents can be properly inventoried as evidence." He looked at Elias with the carefully neutral expression of a lawyer who has decided not to know certain things. If someone were to ensure the box remained where it is, without removing it, without disturbing anything, purely to ensure the evidence chain is maintained, he stopped. You want us to go in and confirm the box is still there, Elias said. I want you to do whatever you think is appropriate, Cole said, still neutral. Without taking anything, Rosalie said. Evidence taken without legal authority can be challenged in court, Cole said. Evidence found in place during a properly ordered search cannot. He folded his hands on his desk. I am telling you this as information, not instruction. Elias looked at Rosalie. She looked at him. We'll think about it, Elias said. Yes, Cole said. Do that. They left his office in the late afternoon and walked out onto Montana Avenue, where the street was busy with end-of-day traffic, and nobody paid them any attention, which was its own kind of relief. Rosalie walked beside him toward the wagon without speaking for half a block. Then she said, He's telling us to go get the box. He's telling us to make sure the box is still there, Elias said, without taking it. And if it's not there, she said. If Crow has already moved it, then we need to know that too, he said. So Cole knows what he's dealing with before the order goes out. She thought about this. Caleb knows that property. The layout of the house, the back office, yes, Elias said. And Caleb said he'd think about it, she said. He did. That young man has thought about nothing else for months, Rosalie said. He just needs one more reason to actually move. I think finding out whether the box is still there qualifies as a reason, Elias said. She stopped walking. He stopped beside her. We'd need to go at night, she said. Yes. And we'd need Caleb to let us in. Yes. She looked at him steadily, this woman who'd stolen 2 eggs out of desperation and had somehow, in the space of 3 weeks, assembled a federal land fraud case out of her father's careful handwriting and a young man's guilty conscience and an old neighbor's decades-old promise. She looked at him the way she looked at a problem she'd already decided to solve, with the particular focus of someone who'd learned that waiting for someone else to fix things was a luxury she couldn't afford. All right, she said. Let's go home and make a plan. The plan was simple in the way that plans are simple before they meet real circumstances, which is to say it was as simple in theory and complicated in every other way. Caleb Marsh would leave the back office window unlatched. He would make sure Crow retired early by suggesting to the cook that the evening meal include the heavier whiskey from the back shelf, not enough to be obvious, just enough to make a tired man sleepy before 9. He would leave the bunkhouse door propped open and position himself where he could see the yard and signal if anyone moved. Elias and Rosalie would go in through the back window, confirm the box was in the cabinet, and come out again without taking anything. Cole had been clear about that. The box needed to be found in place, by proper authority, or the evidence chain broke and Crow's lawyers would spend 6 months arguing about how it was obtained. They went over it 3 times at the kitchen table on Thursday evening, and each time Rosalie asked a question Elias hadn't thought of, and each time he answered it as honestly as he could, which sometimes meant saying he didn't know, and she accepted that the practical equanimity of a woman who'd learned that incomplete information was just the condition of being alive rather than a problem to be solved before you could start moving. What if the cabinet is already empty? She asked the 3rd time through. Then we come out and tell Cole before the order goes through, Elias said. Better to know than to have the marshal's men open it in front of a judge and find nothing. And if Crow wakes up? Crow is 61 years old, and he's been drinking that whiskey every night for 20 years, Elias said. He won't wake up. You don't know that. No, he admitted. I don't know that. She looked at him across the table. I just want to be clear about the parts where we're guessing, she said. Fair, he said. She nodded and looked at her copy of the plan, which she'd written out in her neat hand on a folded piece of paper. Then she folded it again and put it in the stove, and they watched it burn, and neither of them said anything about how final that looked. Friday night came in warm and moonless, which was the one piece of luck that felt genuinely like luck rather than like something they'd constructed. They went on foot from the creek path, the same way they'd gone before, and the cottonwoods were dark shapes against a dark sky, and the creek made enough noise to cover the sound of their moving. Rosalie wore dark clothes and her boots, and she moved well for someone who'd grown up in open spaces rather than practicing stealth, which was to say she moved carefully and didn't hesitate when the ground was uneven, and that was enough. The Probet bunkhouse door was there. The back window was unlatched. Caleb was a shape by the corner of the barn, still enough to be a fence post if you didn't know to look for him. Elias went in first, through the window, feet first and slow, lowering himself to the floor of the back office with his weight on his palms until he was sure of the boards. Then he reached back and helped Rosalie through, one hand at her wrist and one steadying at her arm, and she came through without making a sound except for a small controlled exhale when her feet hit the floor. The office smelled like old tobacco and ledger paper, and the particular smell of rooms that get used for keeping things that aren't supposed to be seen. It was dark enough that the shapes in the room were mostly suggestions: a desk, 2 chairs, shelves along one wall, and there, against the far wall, the cabinet. Rosalie's hand found his arm in the dark, not holding on just orientation, just knowing where the other person was. He put his hand briefly over hers and then moved toward the cabinet. It was solid walnut, 4 feet high, with a single drawer below and a lockable upper section with a key slot that Elias could feel but not quite see. He pulled out the small tool he'd had made in Billings by a man who did metal work, and didn't ask questions, not a copy of the key, because they didn't have the key, but a pick, thin and doubled, the kind that worked on simple brass locks if you had patience and a decent sense of feel. He worked by touch. Rosalie stood behind him and faced the door and watched for light. The lock was a good one, but not exceptional. He told Rosalie 3 days ago it would take him 5 minutes. It took him 11, and those 11 minutes were the longest 11 minutes he could remember spending somewhere that wasn't actively on fire. With every small sound from the rest of the house, arriving in the dark office, amplified to something that sounded like disaster before resolving itself back into the normal noise of an old building settling. Then something shifted under the pick and the lock gave. He held the door to keep it from swinging open fast and moved it slow, until there was enough gap to put his hand inside. His fingers found it immediately. The size and shape of it, a hardware tin, about 8 inches long and 4 inches wide, the kind with a fitted lid that sealed tight. He touched the lid without lifting it. He felt along the sides. He could feel the slight rattle of papers inside when he shifted it, the specific, dense rattle of folded documents that had been in a tin long enough to become part of the tin's weight. He withdrew his hand. He clicked the cabinet door back to where it had been and held the lock closed without relocking it. He couldn't relock it from this side without the key, and if he left it visibly unlocked, someone would notice in the morning. He thought about this for 2 seconds, and then decided there was nothing to be done about it, and moved back to where Rosalie was standing. He put his mouth close to her ear. "It's there," he said. She exhaled. Just once, just long, and he felt her straighten beside him. They went back out the window the way they'd come in, and Elias pulled the window almost closed behind him, not latched, because he couldn't reach the latch from outside, but close enough that it wouldn't swing in the night. Caleb materialized out of the dark beside them before they'd made it to the fence line. "Well," he said. "It's there," Elias said quietly. "Cabinet's been opened. I couldn't relock it." Caleb's face tightened. "He'll know in the morning." "Maybe," Elias said. "Maybe he won't check for a few days. Maybe he'll think he left it unlocked himself." "Crow doesn't forget things like that," Caleb said. "No," Elias said. "He doesn't." He looked at the young man. "Which means we've got less time than we thought. Are you ready to move?" Caleb looked at the house. He stood there with that particular look on his face that Elias had come to recognize, the look of a man measuring what he was about to give up against what he'd already given up by staying, and finding the math closer than he'd expected. "I've got a bedroll and $20, Caleb said. "I can be gone before morning." "Come to my ranch," Elias said. "Stay there until Cole is ready." Caleb nodded once tightly and went back to the bunkhouse, and Elias and Rosalie went back through the cottonwoods and along the creek, and didn't say much of anything, until they were far enough from the property that they could breathe at something like a normal rate. "The cabinet will be unlocked in the morning," Rosalie said. "Yes." "Crow will know someone was there." "Yes." "He'll move the box." "He might," Elias said. "Or he might tighten security and keep it exactly where it is because moving it draws attention." He kept moving through the dark grass. "Crow is smart enough to know that the worst thing he could do right now is panic. He'll think it through before he acts." "That gives us what? A day? 2? "Maybe," Elias said. "Cole needs to know first thing in the morning." They made it back to the ranch well past midnight, and Caleb arrived an hour after that with exactly what he'd said: a bedroll and $20, and the expression of a man who'd crossed a line he'd been standing at the edge of for a long time, and found, now that it was crossed, that the other side felt different than he'd expected. Not easier, necessarily, but different. Cole's response came back in 2 days, and it wasn't what they'd hoped for. The marshals contact a federal deputy named Greer, who'd been building a file on Crow's land dealings for 18 months, had agreed to move on an expedited search order. But the judge who needed to sign it was in Helena, and Helena was 2 days away by telegraph, and the territorial court had its own procedural requirements that didn't bend for urgency, even when urgency was legitimate. 4 days minimum, Cole wrote, possibly 5. Hold the witnesses. Don't move. Rosalie read the letter at the kitchen table. Then she set it down. 4 days. Yes, Elias said. That's 4 days for Crow to discover the cabinet, move the box, and bury anything we need before the order arrives. Yes, he said again. He sat down across from her. Cole knows that. He's pushing as hard as he can. Pushing doesn't open a cabinet, she said. She wasn't wrong. They both knew she wasn't wrong, and there wasn't much to say about it, so they sat with it for a while, in the way you sit with bad news that you can't improve by talking about, until Caleb came in from the barn and poured himself coffee and looked at their faces and said, "What happened?" Elias told him. Caleb listened and then sat down and held his coffee cup in both hands and stared at the table. "He checks that cabinet every Monday," Caleb said. "What day is it today?" Rosalie said. "Saturday," Elias said. "So Monday," Rosalie said. "Monday he finds the cabinet unlocked and everything changes." They had Saturday, Sunday, and then whatever happened Monday would determine everything after it. Nobody said anything for a moment. Then Caleb said quietly, "I know where he keeps a spare key." Both of them looked at him. "Not the one on his chain," Caleb said. He was staring at his coffee cup. "He lost a key about 6 months ago, thought he'd dropped it somewhere on the property, and he had Halverson make a replacement. But 2 weeks later, he found the original in his coat pocket. He put the second key in the tin box, where he keeps his spare watch chain, in the top drawer of his bedroom dresser. He looked up. I saw him put it there when the coat key turned up. He didn't know I was in the hall. A spare key to the cabinet," Elias said slowly. "Yes, in the bedroom dresser. Top drawer on the right side," Caleb said. "In a flat tin about yay big." He showed the size with his fingers. "He's not a man who uses that dresser drawer for anything else. He keeps his valuables in the cabinet." Rosalie and Elias looked at each other. "If someone could get the key from the dresser," Elias said carefully, "and use it to relock the cabinet before Monday, then Crow finds everything as he left it," Rosalie said, "and has no reason to panic or move anything. Which buys us to the order," Elias said. The kitchen was quiet. "Caleb," Rosalie said, "is the spare key in the dresser right now?" "As of Friday morning when I left." "Yes," he said. "And Crow's bedroom, where is it relative to the back office?" "Opposite end of the house," Caleb said. "Ground floor. Window faces the west side, away from the creek." Elias looked at Rosalie. She was already looking at him. She was already with the expression that meant she'd run the math and reached the conclusion, and was waiting to see if he'd reached the same one. "We go back tonight," she said. It wasn't a question. "We go back tonight," he said. Caleb put his head in his hands. "You're both going to get me hanged," he said, but it was more exhausted than serious. And when Elias told him to stay at the ranch and keep the lamps lit so the property looked occupied, he agreed without much argument, which meant he understood the necessity of it, even if he wasn't happy about it. The second trip into Crow's property was harder than the first. Not because the conditions were worse, the night was still warm, the creek still covered their sound, but because both of them knew now, with certainty, what they were risking, and knowledge of risk is a different weight than the abstract version of it. The first time there was still some part of the operation that had felt theoretical. This time there was nothing theoretical about any of it. They went through the back window again. The office was exactly as they'd left it, the cabinet door pulled to but not locked, just as Elias had left it 2 nights before. He clicked it quietly open, confirmed the box was still there, and pulled the door shut again. Then they moved into the hall. Crow's house was bigger than it looked from outside, a long central hallway with rooms off both sides, the office at the back, a parlor and dining room at the front, and the bedroom somewhere beyond a turn in the hall that neither of them had seen before. They moved in single file, Elias first, with one hand on the wall for orientation. The turn opened into a shorter hall. There were 2 doors. One was open a few inches, probably a spare room, and one was closed. From behind the closed door came the slow, heavy sound of someone sleeping the sleep of a man who'd had his nightly whiskey. Rosalie touched Elias's arm and pointed at the closed door. He nodded. She stayed in the hall. He went to the door and listened. The breathing on the other side was deep and rhythmic. He pushed the door open 1 inch at a time, leaning his weight against the frame to prevent creaking, until there was enough gap to slide through. The room was dark, but not pitch black. A window with thin curtains let in enough starlight to make out the shapes. The dresser was on the right wall, a few feet from the door. The bed was across the room. In the bed, Silas Crow slept on his back with one arm across his chest and the other hanging over the side, a heavy-set man in his 60s who looked in sleep considerably less formidable than he looked in waking, the way powerful men often do when they're not in control of their expression. Elias moved to the dresser, top drawer right side. He opened it by degrees, slow enough that the wood didn't catch, slow enough that the movement made almost no sound. He felt inside with his fingers, keeping his eye on the bed. The tin was there. He worked the lid off. The soft pop of it was the loudest thing that had happened since they'd come through the window, and he held his breath and watched Crow's face, and inside were two things, a watch chain and a small brass key. He took the key. He put the lid back on the tin and eased the drawer closed and backed out of the room the way he'd come in, one careful step at a time, keeping his weight on the balls of his feet until he was back in the hall and Rosalie was there, close enough that he could feel the warmth of her without touching her. He held up the key. In the dark of the hallway, she closed both hands around his for a moment, not taking the key. Just that, just for a second, and then they went back to the office. He opened the cabinet. He lifted the box out carefully and set it on the desk. He didn't open it. They hadn't come here to open it. He put the box back in exactly the position he'd found it, the orientation of it, the small dent on the upper right corner facing up the way it had been. He closed the cabinet. He put the key in the lock. He turned it. The click of it locking was the best sound he'd heard in weeks. He pocketed the key. They couldn't put it back. In the dresser now, Crow was too light a sleeper after the first grunt had woken something in Elias's instinct about the man's breathing changing, and they couldn't leave it in the cabinet room. He'd figure out what to do with it later. Right now they needed to be gone. They went out the window, across the yard, through the fence. They were 20 minutes down the creek path, well into the cottonwoods, when Rosalie said, "You took the key." "I couldn't put it back," he said. "Now he'll notice the key is gone." "Maybe," Elias said. "Or maybe he'll think he misplaced it." A man who's already lost a key once is more likely to think he lost it again than to think someone crept into his house while he slept. "That's optimistic," she said. "It's the best option we had," he said. She was quiet for a moment. "Then you went into his bedroom with him right there?" "Yes." "While he was sleeping?" "Yes." That was she stopped. Started again. "Elias, that was an extraordinary thing to do." He didn't answer right away. They walked through the dark with the creek noise beside them and the grass cool and damp against their boots. "You need your property back," he said finally. That seemed like a reasonable step toward it. She looked at him in the dark. He didn't look back, just kept his eyes on the path ahead, but he was aware of her looking. "You're a very unusual man," she said. "I've been told that before," he said, usually as a complaint. "It's not a complaint," she said. The word sat between them without needing to be examined, and they walked the rest of the way back to the ranch without speaking. And when they got there, Caleb was asleep in the chair by the kitchen stove, with a lamp still burning. And the ranch was quiet. And for one long moment, Elias stood in the kitchen doorway and looked at all of it, Caleb in the chair, Rosalie beside him, the lamp, the ordinary worn familiarity of the room, and felt something he hadn't felt about a place in a long time, like it was worth protecting. The order arrived on a Wednesday. Cole sent word by the early mail, a single piece of paper with the federal deputy's name and a date and a time and instructions for Rosalie and Elias to present themselves in Crow's Valley that afternoon as material witnesses to the search. They rode out together, Caleb behind them on the spare horse, and met Cole and Deputy Greer at the junction of the Valley Road at 2 o'clock. Greer was a compact man in his 50s with a marshal's badge and the flat professional patience of someone who'd done difficult things in an official capacity for a long time. He shook Elias's hand and nodded at Rosalie and looked at the Valley Road without wasting time on pleasantries. "Crow will be home?" Greer said. "He keeps office hours in the afternoon," Caleb said. "He'll be there." Greer nodded. "Then let's go." They rode to Crow's property in a group: Cole, Greer, and his 2 deputies, Elias, Rosalie, and Caleb, and the sight of 6 riders coming up the main track brought Pritchard out of the bunkhouse at a fast walk before they'd even reached the yard. Pritchard looked at the badge. He looked at Cole. He looked at Rosalie. His face went through several things, none of them comfortable. "Deputy Greer," Greer said, showing the order. "Federal search. We'll need Mr. Crow." Crow came out of the house himself, which told Elias he'd been watching from the window. He was dressed well as always, with the calm surface of a man who'd learned to keep his face arranged, regardless of what was happening underneath it. He looked at the order in Greer's hands and then at Rosalie and then at Cole, and something shifted in his eyes, not panic, not quite, but the first fractional movement of a man who has built something on a foundation he believed was unassailable and has just heard an unfamiliar sound from the direction of the ground. "This is on very thin grounds," Crow said. "That's for the court to decide," Greer said. "The back office, I'm told." They went inside. Crow walked ahead of them through his own house with the particular rigidity of a man controlling his pace. Elias watched him. He didn't look at the cabinet when they entered the office. He looked at the window, then at Cole, then at Greer. Greer produced the key that Halverson had cut from his records, a copy, made legally, under court order, from the locksmith's original specifications, and put it in the cabinet lock. It turned. The door swung open. And there was the tin box, sitting exactly where Elias had put it back, dent on the upper right corner facing up, looking for all the world like it had sat there, untouched and undisturbed, since Pritchard had put it there a year ago. Crow's breath changed. Elias heard it, a small thing, barely audible, but there. Greer lifted the box out and set it on the desk and opened it and cataloged the contents aloud, while one of his deputies wrote them down. One original land deed for the Mercer property, signed and witnessed, one letter in Henry Mercer's handwriting, 14 pages, one financial ledger covering 11 years of ranch operations. Rosalie stood in the doorway of the office, where Greer had asked the witnesses to stand, and she watched every item come out of that box and be named and recorded. And her face was absolutely still in the way of someone who is holding a very large feeling in a very small space, because this is not the moment for it, and she knows it. Elias stood beside her. He could feel her stillness like something physical. "Mr. Crow," Greer said, when the inventory was complete, "I'll need you to come with me to answer some questions." "On what charge?" Crow said. "On the matter of a forged notary seal," Greer said. "Among other things, Mr. Cole will be filing a full accounting with the territorial court by end of week." Crow looked at Cole. Cole met his gaze without expression. Crow looked at Rosalie. She looked back at him, not with triumph, not with anger, just steadily, the way a woman looks at a man who thought he'd destroyed her and is only now understanding that he was wrong. Pritchard tried to object. One of Greer's deputies put a hand on his arm and said something quiet, and Pritchard subsided. They took Crow out through his own front door and down to the yard, and it was, Elias thought, the most ordinary-looking thing, just a man walking out of his house with two other men on a Wednesday afternoon, and yet it was the hinge on which everything turned. The hearing was set for 3 weeks out, in the federal courthouse in Billings. Those 3 weeks were the strangest of Elias's life, which was saying something, because his life had not been short on strange periods. The ranch became a kind of staging ground, Rosalie preparing her testimony, Cole coming out twice to review it, Caleb going over his account again and again until he could say it without his hands shaking. Thomas Briggs came by once with Martha, and sat at the kitchen table and drank coffee and talked through what he remembered about October 4th until every detail of it was as solid as the table itself. A man named Willis, who'd been the blacksmith in town for 15 years, came to see them 12 days before the hearing. He was a large, quiet man with the careful manner of someone who'd been sitting on something uncomfortable for a long time and had finally decided to stand up. He told them that Crow had asked him to sign a statement confirming the debt note's authenticity. He'd refused. Crow had told him his credit at the lumberyard would be withdrawn if he didn't cooperate. He'd still refused. And then he'd spent 11 months telling himself it wasn't his problem, and he'd watched Rosalie Mercer lose everything. And it had been his problem all along, and he knew it. "I'll testify," he said, "whatever you need." "The dressmaker, Mrs. Aldous," came the next day. She had believed Rosalie from the beginning, she said, and she'd been too afraid to say so, and she was aware that wasn't enough, and she intended to make it better by saying it now in front of people who mattered. An old man named Garrison arrived 4 days before the hearing in a wagon driven by his grandson. Garrison had been a business partner of Henry Mercer's in the early days, and he'd kept a duplicate copy of the original agreement letter that Henry had sent him when the ranch was established, a letter that cross-referenced the same documents Rosalie had in her tin box and confirmed her father's understanding of his own estate. It was, Cole said when he saw it, the kind of corroboration that made a case airtight. The word he used was airtight, and he said it with the particular satisfaction of a lawyer who has spent 3 weeks building something and can finally see that it's going to hold. Rosalie read the duplicate letter alone in the kitchen the night before they left for Billings. Elias didn't go in and she didn't ask him to. He just kept the lamp on in the hall and left her to it. And after a while he heard the paper stop rustling, and then he heard a sound that was brief and controlled and had probably been held for a long time, and then it was quiet. He went out to the porch and sat in the dark for a while. She came out about 20 minutes later and sat in the other chair. He really did plan for all of it, she said. My father. He thought of everything. He knew you, Elias said. She was quiet for a moment. I used to think he worried too much. All those records, all that documentation. He'd write down a conversation and I'd think, Papa, nobody's going to need that. She stopped. He knew. He knew Crow, Elias said. And he knew that the world doesn't always give people like you and him the benefit of the doubt, so he built the doubt out of the equation. She turned her head and looked at him in the dark. People like me. People who have to work for everything and prove twice what someone else gets assumed, he said. Not elaborately, just plainly, the way he said most things. She looked at him for a long moment. Thank you, she said, for everything. I want to say that tonight, before tomorrow, when there will be other things to say and I might not, I want to say it now. You don't have to thank me, he said. I know I don't have to, she said. I want to. She looked at the dark yard. You could have handed me to Pritchard the night you found me in your henhouse. You could have given me a meal and sent me on. You could have told me it wasn't your problem at about 15 different points since then. I could have, he agreed. Why didn't you? He thought about how to answer that honestly. He'd thought about it before, in the way you think about things you're not quite ready to say directly, and he'd found that the real answer was simpler and larger than anything he'd been comfortable saying. Because watching someone fight that hard for something that's rightfully theirs and not helping, he stopped. Started again. I couldn't do it. That's all. I just couldn't. She looked at him. The night was warm and the stars were out over the valley, and the ranch sat quiet around them, with the particular quiet of a place that has been worked and cared for by someone who understood the value of it. We should sleep, she said. Long day tomorrow. Yes, he said. Neither of them moved for another little while. It wasn't the moment for anything beyond what it was, two people on a porch the night before something that had been hard to get to and might still go wrong. But it was something. It had weight and presence, and neither of them felt the need to diminish it by rushing toward or away from it. Eventually, Rosalie went inside. Elias sat alone on the porch for a while longer, listening to the ranch breathe around him in the summer dark, and thought about how a man could live somewhere for years and know every board of it, every fence post and gate and water line, and still find that the place had become something different from what it had been before. Not in the land itself, but in the quality of attention he brought to it, the sense of what was worth protecting and why. He went inside and blew out the lamp and went to bed, and the morning came up gray and clear, and they loaded the wagon and headed for Billings. The federal courthouse in Billings was a brick building on a corner lot that smelled like linseed oil and old authority, the kind of building that had been designed to make people feel small before they'd even found their seat. Rosalie didn't feel small. She felt tired, and her good dress, the one she'd borrowed from Martha Briggs because her own was too worn for a federal. Hearing was slightly too short in the sleeves, and she was aware of it every time she moved her arms. She felt the particular self-consciousness of someone who has never had the luxury of looking the way other people think important people should look, walking into a room full of people who were going to make judgments about her before she opened her mouth. But she didn't feel small. They arrived an hour early because Cole had told them to, and she sat in the corridor outside the hearing room on a wooden bench with Elias on one side and Caleb on the other, and Thomas Briggs across from her with his hat in his hands and his wife beside him, and Willis the blacksmith 2 seats down reading a newspaper without turning any pages, and old Garrison asleep, sitting up with his chin on his chest. You nervous? Caleb said quietly. Yes, Rosalie said. Me too. Good, she said. Nervous means you understand what this is. Caleb looked at her. What if it's not enough? It's enough, she said. Cole says it's enough, and Cole doesn't say things he doesn't mean. What if the judge decides Caleb? She looked at him steadily. It's enough. You did what you did, and Briggs did what he did, And Garrison came all the way from wherever he came from with that letter. It's enough. She paused. Let it be enough. He nodded once and went back to looking at the floor, and she looked at the corridor wall and breathed. Elias beside her said nothing. He just sat with his forearms on his knees and his hat in his hands and his shoulder about an inch from hers, which was enough. Crow's lawyer was a man named Aldgate from Helena, and he was as expensive as he looked. He had the practiced ease of someone who'd spent 20 years in rooms like this one and had learned that confidence projected consistently and at sufficient volume functions almost like evidence. He was silver-haired and well-dressed, and he shook hands with the judge in the corridor beforehand in the way of men who want to make it clear, without saying so directly, that they are the kind of people who shake hands with judges in corridors. Rosalie watched him do this from across the hall and filed it away. Cole watched it too, beside her. Don't let him rattle you, he said quietly. He won't, she said. He's going to try. I know, she said. Let him. The hearing room was smaller than she'd expected, a long table, a raised bench for the judge, chairs along the wall for observers. There were more observers than she'd anticipated. Word had gotten out, the way word always got out in places where a powerful man was finally being asked to account for himself, and the chairs were full. Judge Harlan Foster came in at 9 o'clock, sharp, a thin, dry-looking man in his 60s, who gave the impression of someone who'd heard every kind of story and had stopped being surprised by human nature sometime around 1870 and had simply been cataloging it since. He looked at the papers in front of him. He looked at the room. Let's begin, he said. Cole laid the case out in 40 minutes. He was methodical and quiet, and he did not perform. He simply put one fact after another in front of the judge, with the calm of a man who knows that the facts speak well enough for themselves and that decoration only gives the opposition more to argue about. The forged notary seal, confirmed in writing by Edmund Ferris, who was too elderly to travel, but whose signed affidavit had been properly notarized in Missoula by 2 witnesses. The date discrepancy, October 14th, and Thomas Briggs's direct testimony that Henry Mercer had been bedridden and incapacitated that day. The financial ledger from the tin box, showing 11 years of the Mercer Ranch's accounts with no debt to Crow at any point. The letter from Henry Mercer, 14 pages, read into the record in a silence so complete that Rosalie could hear the clerk's pen moving. And then Garrison's duplicate letter, which corroborated every significant claim in Henry's own account, written independently, kept for 6 years in a box in a barn near Great Falls. When Cole sat down, Aldgate stood up and did what expensive lawyers do. He went at the edges, not the center, because the center was solid and he knew it. He questioned the chain of custody for the tin box. He questioned Ferris's memory at his age. He suggested that Briggs's recollection of a specific date from 11 months ago was the kind of thing that blurred with time. He was good. Rosalie gave him that. He found the weakest points and pressed on them with the practiced gentleness of a man who knew that if you do it hard enough, it eventually becomes doubt. Then he called Rosalie to testify. She sat in the chair beside the judge's bench and looked at the room without flinching. She could see, from where she sat, the faces of the people in the observer chairs. She recognized some of them 3 women from the town, including Eleanor Holt, who had spit on the ground in front of her at the dry goods store, the blacksmith's apprentice. 2 men she knew had done business with Crow for years. She looked at all of them, without performance and without apology, and waited. Aldgate began with the financial history, reasonable questions, professionally delivered. She answered them clearly. When did her father first discuss finances with her? What was her understanding of the ranch's debts? Had she been present for her father's business meetings? Then he shifted. Miss Mercer, he said, with the careful courtesy of a man, sharpening a knife very slowly, you were found, in the weeks following your eviction, on the property of one Elias Boone. Is that correct? Yes, she said. And you were found in his henhouse in the middle of the night? Yes. Taking eggs that weren't yours? 2 eggs, she said. Yes. Aldgate paused, the lawyer's pause, the one that's designed to let something sit in the air. So by your own admission, you are a thief. The room shifted slightly. Rosalie felt it. By my own admission, she said, I took 2 eggs from a henhouse when I had not eaten in nearly 2 days. That is what I did. She kept her voice level. If the court would like to address that matter separately, I'll answer whatever questions it has. But I'd like to note that the contents of that tin box, she nodded toward the evidence table, were documented before I was hungry, by a man who was neither hungry nor desperate, who was simply telling the truth about what was being done to his land. Aldgate moved on, which told her he'd heard the answer and understood that pursuing it would not help him. "Your father's letter," he said. 14 pages of accusations against a man he was in dispute with. Isn't it possible that a sick man, under stress, experiencing significant pain, might have misremembered conversations? Assigned malicious intent to ordinary business discussions? "My father kept records his whole life," Rosalie said. "His ledger is in that box. 11 years of monthly accounts to the penny. He didn't misremember numbers, and he didn't misremember conversations. He was methodical. He was also dying," Aldgate said. "Yes," she said, "he was. And he used the time he had to write down everything he knew, because he understood that I would need it, and he couldn't be there to say it himself." She paused. "I think that's the act of a careful man, not a confused one." Aldgate looked at her for a moment. He had the expression of someone who has encountered an unexpected resistance and is deciding whether to push harder or redirect. He redirected. "Miss Mercer, you are a large woman." He said it plainly, as if it were a relevant legal fact. "You have been described by multiple members of your community as difficult, aggressive. Someone who— I've been described that way by people Silas Crow spoke to before I could," Rosalie said, and her voice was still level, but there was something underneath it now, not anger, something quieter and harder than anger. "I'd like to ask Mr. Aldgate which part of the documented evidence in front of this court is supposed to be explained by my size or my personality." A sound in the observer chairs. Not quite a murmur. "Something," Aldgate said. "I'm simply establishing that your account of events is not." "My account," Rosalie said, "is the same account written by my father before I ever entered this valley. It's the same account confirmed by Thomas Briggs, who has no stake in this beyond the truth. It's the same account confirmed by a retired notary who has nothing to gain by denying his own seal. It's the same account supported by 11 years of financial records that show no debt because there was no debt." She looked at Aldgate without raising her voice. "Which part of that would you like me to explain differently?" The room was quiet. Judge Foster was looking at her over his papers, with an expression that had shifted from the professional blankness he'd started with to something more attentive. Aldgate said no further questions. Caleb testified after her. He was pale and his hand shook slightly when he sat down, and he spoke to the surface of the table more than to the room. But what he said was precise and unrehearsed sounding in the way that true things often are. The specific detail of the tin box going under Pritchard's coat, the moment during the eviction when it happened, the direction Pritchard had walked after. He said he'd seen it, and he'd said nothing. He'd known what it meant, and he'd chosen not to know, and that the choosing had cost him more than he'd expected. Aldgate did not push Caleb very hard. Rosalie thought he'd decided that pushing the reluctant witness was more dangerous than leaving him alone, that a young man visibly struggling with the weight of what he was saying was more convincing, not less. Briggs testified last among their witnesses. He was solid and unhurried, and when Aldgate suggested his memory of October 14th might be imprecise, he said, in the flat tone of a man who has been farming the same land for 30 years, "I remember it because Frank Mercer hadn't been out that way in 3 years, and Henry cried when he saw him. I remember a man crying. I don't forget that." Aldgate sat down. Crow did not testify. This was, Cole had told them the night before, his right, and also a tactical decision by Aldgate, who understood that putting Crow on the stand meant putting him within range of questions about the notary seal and the date and the ledger that he could not answer without lying. And lying under oath in a federal hearing was a specific kind of risk that no amount of money made safe. So Crow sat at the table beside his lawyer and watched the hearing with the surface composure of a man who has not yet decided whether he is in real trouble. And Rosalie watched him watching and thought about her father, sitting in his house, while this man paced his land and told him what he was worth. She didn't feel satisfaction about what was happening to Crow. She'd expected to feel satisfaction, had imagined it on the long nights when she was sleeping rough, and the valley had seemed like a place that had closed its doors to her permanently. But what she actually felt was something more complicated, a tiredness. And underneath the tiredness, something that might eventually become relief. And underneath that, quieter than either, the particular grief of knowing that none of this gave her father back. It gave her his land back. It gave her the truth, officially stated, in a room with a judge and a record and witnesses. It didn't give her back the man who'd written 14 pages to protect her. but he'd written them, and they'd counted. And that was something real. Judge Foster took 40 minutes to deliberate. They waited in the corridor on the same wooden bench. Nobody talked much. Garrison had woken up and was eating something from his coat pocket. Willis was still holding the unread newspaper. Caleb had his elbows on his knees and his head down. Elias sat beside Rosalie and at one point, without making anything of it, put his hand over hers on the bench between them. She didn't pull away. They sat like that until the clerk came out and said the judge was ready. Foster's ruling was 20 minutes long, and most of it was legal language that Rosalie followed imperfectly, but the center of it was clear. The debt note presented by Silas Crow against the estate of Henry Mercer was fraudulent. The notary seal was forged. The signature was obtained through misrepresentation, and the date of signing was demonstrably impossible, given the documented physical condition of the deceased. The eviction of Rosalie Mercer from the property was therefore unlawful. The Mercer Ranch was to be returned to its rightful owner. Furthermore, Foster said, the evidence presented suggested a pattern of fraudulent land acquisition that warranted investigation into Crow's other property claims in the valley. Deputy Greer's office would coordinate that investigation. Any parties who believed they had been similarly defrauded were encouraged to come forward. Crow's composure finally cracked, not dramatically, just a tightening around the jaw, a single moment where his eyes went somewhere private and ugly before he pulled them back. Aldgate put a hand on his arm. Rosalie heard the ruling and sat with it. She'd been holding herself so carefully through all of it, through the testimony and the pauses, and Aldgate's careful needling, and the weight and needling in the corridor, that for a moment she didn't know what to do with the fact that it was over. That the specific shape of the fight she'd been having for the last months had just concluded, and she was on the right side of it, and her father's records had counted. She pressed her lips together. She breathed through her nose. Elias beside her said very quietly, Rosalie. She looked at him. You did it, he said. We did it, she said. No, he said. Your father did most of it. We just carried it the last mile. She looked at him for a moment. Then she looked at the table in front of her, and at her own hands, and at the tin box sitting in the evidence clerk's arms waiting to be officially returned to her, and she let herself feel it, not performance, not relief in any simple sense, but the specific weight of something that has been carried for a long time finally being set down. It was heavy, even in the setting down. The drive back to the valley was long, and the wagon was full. Briggs and Martha had their own rig. Garrison's grandson had come to fetch the old man. Caleb rode behind, quieter than he'd been in weeks, with the look of someone who had put something down too, and wasn't quite sure yet what his hands were supposed to do without it. Rosalie had the tin box on her lap. She didn't open it. She'd read everything in it, more times than she could count. She just kept it there, under her hands, while the miles went by. They reached the fork where Briggs would turn south, and Rosalie would turn east, toward her father's property. Elias had the reins, and he slowed the wagon at the fork without being asked. Briggs pulled alongside them. He looked at Rosalie across the gap between the wagons with the expression of a man who has carried something uncomfortable for a long time and is only now beginning to put it down. Your father was a good man, he said. I know, Rosalie said. I should have stood up sooner. You stood up when it mattered, she said. And she let that be the end of it, because there was no version of dwelling on it that made anything better, and she was tired of things that didn't make anything better. Briggs nodded. Martha reached over and briefly pressed Rosalie's hand, the small, fast grip of a woman communicating something she didn't have words for, and then they turned south and were gone. Caleb came up alongside the wagon. Which way do I go, he said. He meant it practically. He had a bedroll and $20, and no property in any direction, but it had the sound of a larger question. Come to Boone's place tonight, Rosalie said. We'll figure out the rest tomorrow. Caleb nodded and fell back, and Elias turned the wagon east. The Mercer Ranch looked smaller than she remembered. That was the first thing, the specific surprise of returning to a place you've carried in your memory for months and finding that the real version of it doesn't quite match the version you've been protecting. The house was there, and the barn, and the garden that had gone wild without tending, and the fence line she could see from the road that needed work in at least 2 places. There was a lock on the door that hadn't been there before, a heavy one, Crow's edition, and she'd have to break it to get in. She got down from the wagon and stood in the yard for a moment. The summer light was long by now late afternoon gold, the kind that made everything look like a painting of itself, and the property was quiet in the specific way of a place that has been empty for a while and is waiting to be reminded what it's for. She walked to the door and looked at the lock. Elias was beside her with a crowbar before she'd worked out how she was going to get through it. "This will damage the frame," he said. "I'll fix the frame," she said. He worked the crowbar in, and the lock gave with a sound that was too loud in the quiet yard, and the door swung open. The inside smelled like dust and a stranger's habits. Someone had been using the house, Crow's men probably, using it carelessly the way people use things they don't own. There were marks on the floor she didn't recognize, and the furniture had been moved, and one of the kitchen chairs was missing. She stood in the doorway and looked at it. "It's a mess," Caleb said, appearing behind them. "Yes," she said. "We can clean it," Elias said. "I know," she said. And she meant it, she knew it as a practical fact, not a comfort, the way she knew most things. The mess was real, and the cleaning was also real, and one led to the other if you were willing to do the work. She had never not been willing to do the work. She walked into the kitchen and put the tin box on the table, her father's table, the one he'd built himself from local timber in the second year he'd owned the property, solid and unbeautiful and made to last, and she stood with her hands on the lid for a moment. Then she took a breath and went to find a broom. They worked until dark. All three of them, without discussion about who was doing what, in the practical way of people who understand that a job in front of you is just a job, and it gets done by doing it. Caleb swept. Elias moved the furniture back to where it belonged, deducing the original positions from the wear patterns on the floor. Rosalie cleaned the kitchen, found the missing chair in the back room, behind a pile of feed sacks someone had stored there, and dragged it back to the table where it went. She found, in the second hour, her father's pipe on the windowsill in the bedroom. She'd forgotten about it. He'd had it for 30 years, a plain clay pipe that he almost never smoked because it irritated his chest, but he'd kept it on the sill because he said he liked the shape of it. She hadn't seen it when she'd been evicted. She'd been moving too fast, taking only what she could carry, and she'd assumed it was gone. She held it in her hands for a moment. It was nothing, as objects go. A pipe. She set it back on the windowsill where it belonged and kept working. By the time the dark had fully settled, they'd gotten the main rooms back to something that felt like the house rather than a stranger's temporary occupation of it. And the three of them sat at the kitchen table, with the last of the food Rosalie had packed from Elias's ranch bread and cold meat and coffee from a pot she'd managed to make work on her father's stove, and ate without much talking. Caleb fell asleep at the table, which he didn't seem to realize until his head dropped and jerked back up, and Rosalie pointed him at the spare room without discussion. Then it was just her and Elias at the table. The lamp was burning low, and the house was quiet, except for the sounds an old house makes when the temperature drops at night and the boards settle, and outside the crickets had started. And the valley was the valley. The same valley it had been when she was a girl helping her father with the morning milk, before any of this had happened. "You should stay tonight," she said. "It's too late to ride back." "I wasn't planning to ride back tonight," he said. "Good." She looked at her coffee cup, the spare room's taken. "I've slept in barns before," he said. "The couch is decent," she said. He looked at her across the table. "I know this isn't what you pictured," he said. "When you thought about getting the ranch back. I know the actual thing is never the same as the thing you've been carrying." She looked at him steadily. "No," she said, "it's not. It's smaller in some ways and bigger in others." She paused. "It's real, which the picture never was. And real is harder and also better." He nodded. "My father used to say that the land doesn't care about your feelings," she said. He meant it practically. You show up, and you do the work regardless of your feelings, because the animals need feeding, and the fence won't fix itself. But I think he also meant something else. The land just is what it is. It was here before us, and it'll be here after, and what we do with the time in between is our own business. She looked at the table. "I wasted a lot of time being ashamed of myself before I came to understand that Crow's opinion of me wasn't a fact. It was just a thing he said because it was useful to him." Elias was quiet. "The people in that courtroom," she said, "when I was on that stand. They looked at me the way they've always looked at me, like they were trying to figure out how someone who looked like me ended up in a place that mattered. Like there must be some mistake." She looked at her hands. "And I realized that I have spent years trying to make myself smaller so people would find me easier to accept. Walking quieter. Not pushing back when I should have. Being careful not to take up too much space." She stopped. "I'm done with that." "Good," Elias said simply. I know I'm not what people think a woman is supposed to look like, she said. I know that's never going to change, not them, and not me either, because I am what I am, and I've worked hard enough with this body that I'm not going to start apologizing for it. She looked at him. I just want to be clear about that, in case there's any confusion. There isn't any confusion, Elias said. You say that now. Rosalie, he said, I found you in my henhouse holding 2 eggs. I watched you rebuild a case from scratch, using nothing but your father's handwriting and your own determination. I went into a man's bedroom while he slept to relock a cabinet because the alternative was watching someone take something from you that was rightfully yours. He met her eyes. I think I've been clear about what I see. She looked at him for a long moment. There are things that get said, and there are things that are simply true, and sometimes those overlap, and sometimes they don't. And she had learned over the course of a very hard year to tell the difference. What she saw in Elias Boone's face across the table in the lamplight was the second kind, not a declaration, not a performance. Just a man saying a thing that was true for him the way a boundary fence is true, straight and plain and built to hold. All right, she said softly. All right, he said. In the months that followed, the valley changed in the slow way that valleys change, not all at once, and not without resistance, but steadily. Deputy Greer's investigation into Crow's other land acquisitions turned up 2 more fraudulent debt claims, both following the same pattern. The families the Hartley place on the North Fork and the Olson property down by the river filed their own cases, both of them using some of the same evidence that Rosalie's case had established. Cole represented both. Neither case was as clean as Rosalie's, because Greer had been right that Crow had refined his methods over time, but both were successful. Crow lost the Mercer property, the Hartley property, and the Olson property. He retained his other holdings because the fraud hadn't extended everywhere, but his standing in the valley was gone, which for a man who'd spent 20 years building it was its own kind of sentence. Aldgate sent a bill. Crow paid it. He was quieter after that and smaller, and the feed store changed hands within a year. Pritchard left the valley before the investigation extended to him, which everyone noted and nobody officially acted on, because Greer had bigger concerns than a deputy who'd carried a box under his coat. Caleb stayed. He worked Elias's ranch through the summer and into the fall, and proved to be as capable as a man who'd spent 4 years doing whatever Crow told him had any right to expect himself to be, which is to say capable enough, with room to grow, which is all anyone can reasonably ask of themselves at 23. He was not effortless, and he was not cheerful every day, and he made mistakes that had to be corrected. But he showed up, and he learned, and he didn't quit when things were harder than he'd expected, and by October, Elias had stopped thinking of him as temporary. Rosalie's ranch came back to life, the way things come back to life after a hard winter, not dramatically, not all at once, but one small thing at a time. The garden went in late that first year and didn't produce much, but it produced something, and the following year she expanded it. The broken fence on the east line got fixed in the fall. The barn needed work on the roof, and she did half of it herself, on a ladder, in September, and asked Elias for help with the high section, which he gave without making it into anything more than what it was. The house she had to make hers again in the particular way you have to make a place yours after someone else has used it carelessly. She painted the kitchen a different color than it had been, a warm clay color, not a color her father had chosen, and she let herself not feel guilty about that. She kept the pipe on the windowsill. She kept the ledger on the desk, not because she needed to look at it anymore, but because it deserved a place in her home, the way things that were part of a story deserve to be kept even after the story has resolved. She and Elias worked out a rhythm between the 2 properties that had no formal name and required no formal conversation. He came over most mornings to help with what needed helping. She went over most evenings because his kitchen was larger and they'd fallen into the habit of eating there when there was a reason, and at her place when there wasn't one. The reasons multiplied. It wasn't smooth. Rosalie had a temper that she managed well until she didn't, and Elias had a stubbornness that he packaged as patience so effectively that it sometimes took her 3 days to realize she'd lost an argument without knowing there'd been one. She had opinions about how accounts should be kept that differed from his opinions on the same subject, and they worked through those differences the way people do who have decided that the other person's presence is worth the friction of sometimes being wrong. She had bad nights. The kind where the year came back to her not as memory, but as sensation, the cold of sleeping rough, the specific humiliation of Eleanor Holt's face. The sound the crowbar made when Aldgate said large woman in a federal courtroom, like it was a legal finding. She didn't always tell Elias about these nights, because she'd spent a long time being the only one managing herself, and the habit didn't break all at once. But she told him sometimes. And he listened the way. He listened to most things without trying to fix what couldn't be fixed, without telling she should feel differently than she felt, without making her feel like her difficulty was a problem he hadn't signed up for. One afternoon in October, a woman came to the Mercer gate. Rosalie was in the garden, and she came around to the front and found a woman about 40 standing at the gate with a child on her hip, and a look that was equal parts determination and the specific exhaustion of someone who has been deciding to do something for a long time and has finally started doing it. "You're Rosalie Mercer," the woman said. "I am," Rosalie said. "My name is Clara Dodd. My husband lost his place to a note about 2 years ago. Not Crow, someone else, up north. But the way you described it in that courtroom," she stopped. "The dressmaker wrote me about the case. I've been reading the coverage in the Billings paper. I wondered if you knew, if you could tell me." She paused again. "I don't know where to start." Rosalie looked at her for a moment. At the child on her hip and the determination in her face and the tiredness underneath it. "Come inside," she said. "I'll write down Nathaniel Cole's address in Billings, and I'll tell you everything I know, which is more than I had when I started." Clara Dodd came inside. The kettle went on. They sat at the kitchen table, the one Henry Mercer had built from local timber, in the second year he'd owned the property. And Rosalie talked for 2 hours about documents and notary seals and witnesses, and what it meant to have evidence and what it meant to use it. And Clara Dodd listened with the focused attention of a woman who has decided that listening carefully might be the thing that saves her. When she left, she had a list of names and Cole's address and a duplicate of the questions Rosalie had used to organize her own case, written out in Rosalie's careful hand. Rosalie stood in the doorway and watched her go, and thought about her father writing 14 pages by lamplight in a room where he was already dying, and thought about the particular stubbornness of people who refuse to let injustice be the last word, just because the injustice is loud and well-funded and has a lawyer from Helena. She thought about what she knew now that she hadn't known a year ago. Not about legal strategy or document chains or the layout of a man's house in the dark. Those things were useful, but they weren't the lesson. The lesson was simpler and harder, that the people who dismiss you have done you the accidental favor of underestimating you, and that underestimation, if you're patient enough to let it stand long enough, is its own kind of tool. Crow had looked at her, a heavy-set woman in a patched dress, no money, no connections, no legal standing, and had decided she was not a serious problem. He'd been wrong about all of it. He'd been wrong about the dress, because what was inside it was not what he'd assumed. He'd been wrong about the money, because money is not the only resource that builds a case. He'd been wrong about the standing, because standing is not given, it is taken, and she had taken it one piece of evidence at a time. She had not been, in the end, the easiest version of a victim. She had been inconvenient and stubborn, and she had refused to be ashamed of her hunger, or her size, or her temper, or the 2 eggs she'd taken from a henhouse when she had nothing else. And that refusal was not a character flaw. It was the thing that had kept her moving when moving was the only way forward. Elias came in from the barn at 4:30 and found her still standing in the doorway. "Who was that?" he said. "Someone who needed a starting point," she said. He came to stand beside her. He looked at the empty road where Clara Dodd's wagon had been. "You gave it to her," he said. "Cole will give it to her," Rosalie said. "I just told her who Cole was and what questions to ask." She paused. "My father would have done the same. He was the kind of man who didn't hoard information. He thought knowledge was only useful if you passed it on." Elias looked at her. "You're the same kind," he said. She looked at the road for another moment. Then she said, "There's cornbread in the oven and about 20 minutes left on it. Stay for supper." "I was planning to," he said. "Good," she said. And she stepped back inside and he followed her, and the door closed on the October afternoon, and inside the warm kitchen, the smell of cornbread was the smell of something that was finally, in all its imperfect and ordinary and hard-won reality, hers. There is something people get wrong about survival. They talk about it like it's a destination, like, if you survive the hard thing, you arrive somewhere better, and the hard thing is behind you. But survival isn't a destination, it's a practice. You survive, and then you survive the next day and the next. And what changes is not that it gets easy, but that you get better at knowing what you're surviving for. Rosalie Mercer survived a year that should have broken her. She survived it with 2 eggs, a tin box, a borrowed letter, and a man who showed up when he didn't have to and stayed when it was inconvenient. And she'd built from those materials something that was real and solid and worth the building. The people who'd written her off had never understood what they were looking at. They'd seen her size and her hunger and her worn dress and decided they knew the whole story. They never understood that the woman standing in the henhouse in the dark, holding 2 eggs against her chest, was not the ending of anything. She was just getting started.